Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he is not opposed to Slovakia hosting peace talks with Ukraine to end the war, while Kyiv questions their intentions. North Gaza's last hospital is set ablaze after Israeli troops raided it, clearing out staff and patients. The facility had been under siege for weeks. A double impeachment in South Korea after the acting president is also ousted, prolonging the political turmoil and plunging the country's currency. Now to our top story today. As the war in Ukraine nears its third year, Russia's President Vladimir Putin says he's open to peace talks with Ukraine in Slovakia. That's after the country's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, visited the Kremlin this week, offering Slovakia as a venue for negotiations. Putin has repeatedly said Moscow is open to talks to end the conflict.
Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico said that if it comes to negotiations, he would be happy to provide his country's venue for such negotiations. We are not against it if it comes to that. Why not? Because Slovakia has a neutral position. From our point of view, this position is neutral and it is an acceptable option for us.
Meanwhile, Robert Fico is one of the few European leaders to maintain ties with the Kremlin despite Western efforts to isolate Russia. Slovakia, which is an EU and NATO member, halted military aid to Ukraine and called for peace talks last year. Fico has accused Kyiv of threatening his country's supply of Russian natural gas, on which it heavily depends. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly criticized Slovakia for its friendly tone towards Russia. Zelensky has called Fico's pro-Russian energy policy a major security issue for Europe and has also questioned his motives.
We are fighting for our lives. Fico is fighting for money, and hardly for money for Slovakia. Shadowy agreements with Putin are either a trade in state interests or work for his own pocket.
On his part, Slovakia's foreign minister says his country is hoping for a peaceful solution to end the conflict. He also said Vladimir Putin's comments on peace talks were a positive signal for the ending of the ongoing war with Ukraine. For some analysts and reaction, I'm joined by Oleksiy Goncharenko, a Ukrainian member of parliament for the European Solidarity Party, and he joins us now from Odessa. Oleksiy, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, President Putin is suggesting Slovakia as a neutral country to host peace talks with Ukraine. What do you make of this choice?
In reality, Slovakia under Prime Minister Fico is not neutral. That's clear because Slovakia has its own interest. A negotiator couldn't have its own interest. That's the story. Also, we all understand with you, with all respect to Slovakia, we need mediators who can influence Russia, who can influence the world stage. Because this is a war where 1 million people involved. And there's not so many countries in the world. It can be United States of America. It can be European Union. With all respect to Slovakia, they can't. And in general, for me, the most important is security guarantees to Ukraine after ending of hostilities, because Putin is not going to end the war. He just wants a ceasefire to refresh, replenish, and to attack again. And this is very important for us, who will give us these security guarantees that Russia will not attack anymore. And it's clear that Slovakia can't do anything about this.
So you say Slovakia can't do anything, but do you think Ukraine should enter into peace talks with Russia in the new year at some point after Donald Trump's inauguration?
Yes, definitely. There is nobody else in the world who wants peace more than Ukraine. We want peace desperately because we are dying every day. So we want it as soon as possible. But we want a real peace, not a ceasefire.
Both sides will have to make some concessions, Ukraine and Russia, as part of these negotiations that will go forward possibly. What do you think those will have to be for both sides, for yourselves in Ukraine and for Putin in Russia, for there to be an end to this killing?
I stand for international law. International law is clear. Russia invaded Ukraine. It occupies our sovereign territory. If we don't want other countries to attack their neighbors in order to change borders or anything like this, we need international law to be restored. So when you're speaking about concessions, I think it shouldn't be international law and international order. It's not for Ukraine, it's for other countries in the world. Will they suffer from the wars like this? Also, I want to remind you that Ukraine is the only state in human history which voluntarily gave up nuclear weaponry 30 years ago under guarantees of the United States and United Kingdom and Russia, which is funny. And what will be the signal to the world to non-proliferation policy if after this part of our territories will be occupied and kept by aggressor? That will mean just one thing. It will be signal to everybody to go nukes because nothing else is promoting security to them.
The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also said Russia was willing to improve ties with the US if the incoming administration makes its first move. Are you concerned about the impact this could have on Ukraine? Are you concerned about Trump coming into the White House and what that could mean for the aid that's been sent to Ukraine and the weapons?
We have hopes on Donald Trump. He said he wants to finish the war. He said that he wants, as he said, to drill, to drop the oil prices. So we have hopes that President Trump will be the president who will end this war. Definitely also we have concerns because we don't know exactly what he will do. But in any way, for the moment, President Trump is a hope for many Ukrainians.
Ukrainian Member of Parliament, Oleksiy Goncharenko, thank you so much for joining me this evening. We appreciate your time. Now, Moscow says it's willing to work with President-elect Donald Trump's incoming government to improve relations with the United States, but only if Washington makes the first move. That's according to Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Staying with the ongoing war in the shadow of peace talks, Russia and Ukraine appear to be ramping up attacks. According to Ukraine, 6 civilians have been killed following Russia's missile strikes. Over the last 6 months, reports suggest Moscow's drone attacks are increasing dramatically. For more, I'm joined by our reporter in Kyiv, that's Alex Kadier. Alex, good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. So we just had the Ukrainian Member of Parliament on today. He was talking about Slovakia possibly holding these peace talks. What's your feeling on the ground in Kyiv?
Well, certainly that news has been welcomed with a degree of scepticism because Slovakia is not seen, since the Fico government came into office, as a friendly nation to Ukraine. Their first move in office was to end all military aid to this country, although by that point Slovakia's military aid to Ukraine was rather limited, and so the prospect of having peace talks in Slovakia seems quite far-fetched to most Ukrainians. They don't see Slovakia as a neutral party, particularly because Robert Fico himself was in Moscow meeting with President Putin just in the last week or so. So certainly some degree of skepticism. They've heard similar proposals from Hungary, from Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister there, also friendly with Russia, very much against the grain of European countries who have not visited with President Putin and who do not want to make negotiations about the future of Ukraine without the Ukrainians' input. So certainly a degree of skepticism, particularly because Slovakia would put itself into quite tricky legal waters if it hosted these so-called peace talks.
Alex, let's just shift gears slightly. Reports today suggesting Russia has been ramping up its strikes on Ukraine over the past 6 months. Now, what impact has this had on fighting and on the country itself? We know their energy systems have been heavily hit.
Yeah, well, there's two aspects here. There's the military aspect. We know that the momentum in this war at the moment is on Russia's side. They continue to advance on the town of Pokrovsk. They continue to advance in other places, and they continue to push back Ukrainian forces in Russia's Kursk region. So on the military front, on the battle front, that momentum, including these strikes using glide bombs that are very difficult to intercept on the way down, that the momentum is on Russia's side. We know Ukraine is fighting back and is limiting these Russian advances, but certainly it is a difficult time for the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, there is also the national morale perspective, because almost every single day, be it in Kyiv, in Poltava, in Kherson, in other places in Ukraine, you have air alerts. You have Iranian-made Shahed drones flying above, targeting sometimes energy infrastructure, sometimes residential buildings, sometimes military targets. What does that do to the national morale? Well, rolling blackouts. I was speaking to people just in the last couple of days who had their Christmas dinners in the dark. They couldn't cook their food because they didn't have power to do so. So certainly that will chip away at Ukrainian morale. That is the objective, at least as seen by Ukraine. That is Russia's objective. That is certainly what we see on a daily basis in Ukraine, and particularly on the morning of Christmas Day, just a couple of days ago, with more than 70 missiles, more than 100 drones fired at Ukraine in a single night. Nevertheless, and what we hear from Ukrainian leadership is, even though this war is grinding and this war is difficult, they do not want to agree to a ceasefire which could then be ignored in a matter of months by Russia, as they have seen done in the past. So despite the difficulties, Ukraine is steadfast in its desire for security guarantees and a lasting peace.
Yes, that was what Alexei was just saying to us earlier. Alex, a North Korean soldier has been captured earlier today by Ukrainian forces. What do we know about his condition and where he currently is?
Well, we know very little about the details of his capture. He was the first North Korean to be captured. We've also seen reports in Ukrainian media that he has since died from his injuries, his combat injuries. Now, that is really as much as we know. Of course, it is difficult to get a lot of information. This is still a country at war, and so for operational security, the details are slim. But we do have a bigger picture from President Zelensky in the last few days, talking about those North Korean casualties, saying that 3,000 of them have been either killed or wounded in this war. Now, these estimates, again, are very difficult to verify, so you have to take them with a pinch of salt. But even if that 3,000 number is accurate, that would mean that a quarter of the 12,000 North Korean troops that have been sent here have been either killed or injured in this conflict. I've spoken to some on the Ukrainian front line saying that although the North Korean soldiers seem very brave, they lack training, they are not used to this kind of environment in which they are fighting, and so certainly their combat effectiveness is questioned by the Ukrainians. But this individual, the first to be captured since those North Korean troops started fighting Ukrainians, is certainly a symbol of that struggle.
Alex Kadier, our reporter in Kyiv, thank you for joining us this evening. Let's turn to the Middle East now, where a series of explosions were heard in Gaza last night. This comes as both Israel and Hamas blame each other for stalling ceasefire efforts to end the war. Elsewhere, one of northern Gaza's last functioning hospitals has been stormed by Israeli forces. According to reports, medical staff were given just 15 minutes to move patients to safety. This comes after the director of the Kamal Adwan hospital said around 50 people were killed in Israeli airstrikes targeting the healthcare facility. Israeli airstrikes in Gaza have also targeted journalists. Yesterday, 5 Palestinian journalists were hit outside the Al Awad hospital. According to reports, they were from Al-Quds Today and died when an airstrike hit their broadcasting van. The Israeli military said it had targeted a group of militants. People living in Gaza are not only enduring the war, but also facing the harsh cold. 3 Palestinian babies have frozen to death from falling temperatures in the past week. A baby girl named Sila froze to death in the Al-Mawazi humanitarian camp, which is meant to be a safe zone for civilians. Thousands of displaced Palestinians are currently living there in makeshift tents as temperatures fall. UNICEF has warned that many displaced children in Gaza have nothing but the clothes they fled in as they escaped Israel's bombardment wearing only summer clothes. Footage from a courtyard in Al-Mawazi shows Sila's small body wrapped in a white blanket with her father holding her.
My baby girl woke up in the middle of the night from the cold. Her mum breastfed her, but by morning, when we tried to feed her again, we found her blue. She had bitten her tongue so hard that she was bleeding from the mouth. Her body was curled up from the cold. Health officials said her heart stopped because of the cold. Look at her tongue. It was bleeding from the bite. She also bled from her nose. We're sleeping on sand and the tent is unlivable.
Joining me now from northern Gaza is Dr. Amjad Al-Lewa, who is an emergency medicine specialist with experience in several hospitals around Gaza. I just want to say thank you so much for your time this evening. Israeli forces raided the Kamal Adwan hospital earlier this morning. What does this mean for the health system in northern Gaza, which is already under severe pressure?
Hello. About Kamal Adwan Hospital, it was trapped for more than 80 days without electricity, water, and any medical supplies. Many of patients who are in ICU department were dead because of no electricity, beside the newborn babies who are in need of oxygen also were dead. Kamal Adwan was the only hospital was working in the north of Gaza in Jabalia, where many crimes happened. So shutting down this hospital, meaning that all injured people in Jabalia will dead. Moreover, Israel attacked the hospital by take all injured people from this hospital with the medical staff, and including women and men, for investigation, and many of them was prison. Israel bombed inside Kamal Adwan hospital many times, and many people from both injured people and medical staff were killed there.
Doctor,
before a few hours we heard that Kamal Adwan hospital was burned and the fire distributed to the all hospital departments. It's remember us by Al-Shifa hospital crime. It was a horrible crime against humanity. Today, while I was working in Al-Shifa emergency department, I received many cases from Kamal Adwan hospital, and they told us that all medical staff and all injured people evacuated from Kamal Adwan hospital.
Doctor, what are the facilities like where you're working in at the moment? How are you managing to cope? We're obviously seeing reports of a dire humanitarian situation, including babies freezing. How are you coping?
The situation here is very bad and horrible. There is cold, and all the people here, most of them lived in tents. So many of babies are frozen to death.
What justification has...
What?
No, carry on.
About the health system in Gaza here, it suffers from shortage of medical personnel, as many of medical staff went to south beside heavily bombing in north of Gaza, and a huge number of injured people coming to the hospital where is no enough medical beds or medical staff to deal with them. The health situation is horrible and unimaginable at all. And there is a lack of all surgical specialty like neurosurgery, pediatric surgery, urology. So many injured people facing death because there is no doctors here.
What justification was given by Israeli forces before clearing the hospital earlier today? We spoke about you receiving patients from the hospital. What have you heard from the Israeli side?
I don't hear anything about them.
No problem at all. I just wanted to say to you, you know, we've seen a dire humanitarian situation at the moment in northern Gaza. What do you hope for the future? How can you see a way forward?
Right now, the bombing is still continuous heavily in north of Gaza. And daily we have crimes happened by families who are completely removed from the civil registry. In the future, we hope this war stopped and I can see peace in all the Gaza city. We don't like this war. We don't like fighting. We don't need this anymore. We want just peace.
Dr. Amjad Elilewa, who is an emergency medicine specialist with experience in several hospitals around Gaza, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, South Korea's parliament has voted to impeach acting President Han Duck-soo. This comes less than 2 weeks after suspending President Yoon Suk-yeol's powers over his declaration of martial law. Following today's vote, Han says he will step aside to avoid more political chaos in the country. I'm pleased to say for more on this, I'm joined by the former British ambassador to North Korea. That's John Everard. John, thanks so much for joining me this evening. John, just 2 weeks into the job and, well, he's already out. Why has he been impeached?
Because Yoon Suk-yeol was impeached, as you've just said, on the 14th of December. The process of impeachment in South Korea requires the recommendation of impeachment to go to the Constitutional Court for approval and ratification. But the Constitutional Court, which is supposed to have 9 members, currently only has 6. There are 3 vacancies. So the National Assembly was trying to rush through 3 nominees to fill those seats. And Han Duck-soo, faced with rowing MPs and a lot of dissent between the 2 major parties in South Korea, said no, he, as acting president, was not going to sign off these 3 until the political parties reached a bipartisan agreement on who should fill the vacancies in the Constitutional Court. The opposition immediately flew into a rage, said that Han Duck-soo was subverting the Constitution, that he was siding with former President Yoon Suk-yeol, and they moved to impeach him. Now, under the South Korean Constitution, to impeach a president, you need 2/3 of the votes in the Constitution, in the National Assembly. But to impeach a cabinet minister, you only need a simple majority. The opposition-controlled National Assembly has argued that because Han Duck-soo is only an acting president, they can impeach with a simple majority, which they can command from within their own ranks. They don't need votes from the ruling party. So they've done that, but the ruling party are very unhappy with this. They say that this itself is a breach of the Constitution and have vowed to fight it. It really is quite complicated.
Yes, indeed. It is a little bit complicated, but thank you for outlining that for us. Today's developments, to me and to the rest of our audience, really highlights this ongoing crisis in South Korea's political landscape, which, as you say, is complicated. What's to come next? What can we expect from the country?
Well, I think the next move will happen probably not in the National Assembly, but in the Constitutional Court itself. You see, the Constitutional Court, while the politicians have been arguing, has ruled that although it only has 6 judges sitting at the moment, it can still convene and it can still hear cases. So President Yoon's impeachment trial actually started today. They fired the starting gun. And the defence team and the prosecution have both put down depositions before the court. Now, a lot depends on what the court does next. Having established the principle that it is allowed to sit even though it doesn't have its full quorum of 9 members, it follows that it can also rule on, firstly, whether the acting president is allowed to appoint the 3 remaining justices who was legal or not. Or a 2/3 majority is a matter for the Constitutional Court. If the Constitutional Court rules that no, the National Assembly exceeds its powers, then Han Duck-soo goes back to being acting president and we have proper governance restored in South Korea. If it doesn't, then governance will be taken over by another acting president, a man called Chae Sang-mok, who's the deputy prime minister, and who, like Han Duck-soo, is one of the great grey men of South Korean politics, a technocrat. He's not a political leader at all, who has said he just wants to try to steady the ship, give South Korea some kind of government while all this is sorted out.
John, I actually just want to switch gears to something that's come out today. So reports suggest Ukraine has captured a wounded North Korean soldier. I guess this is pretty rare. And how valuable to Ukraine and Western powers is this?
It's valuable in that it's very difficult to argue now that North Koreans are not involved in this war. As you know, the Russians and the North Koreans have been at pains to deny this increasingly obvious fact. The captured soldier actually died a few hours after he was captured, died of his wounds. So there won't be any time to interrogate him. But in general, captured North Korean soldiers would be very valuable to the Ukrainians because they can swap them for Ukrainian prisoners of war on the other side. In prisoner swaps, I don't think there's any doubt that to answer too many questions, Ukrainian or to South Korea.
John, we appear to be having some technical problems. I'm so sorry for that, but we'd like to thank you, the former British ambassador to North Korea there, John Everard. And a reminder of our top stories today. Russian President Vladimir Putin says he's not opposed to Slovakia hosting peace talks with Ukraine to end the war, while Kyiv questions their intentions. North Gaza's last hospital is set ablaze after Israeli troops raided it, clearing out staff and patients. The facility had been under siege for weeks. A double impeachment in South Korea after the acting president is also ousted, prolonging the political turmoil and plunging the country's currency. And that's all from us on W News. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Riz Khan is coming up next, and don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night and happy Friday.
At our Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello, I'm Riz Khan. Welcome to the show. From Australia to the US, 300 million people around the world live in jurisdictions that allow residents a choice to end their lives prematurely in order to escape the pain and indignity of a protracted death. The UK Parliament recently became the latest legislature to take a step towards legalising assisted dying in England and Wales. MPs were freed from party loyalties for an emotional, respectful debate that contrasted with the political combat that often punctuates the House of Commons. At its conclusion, a majority voted in favour of a bill that would permit some adults to use drugs prescribed to end their lives. But there were conditions. They would have to be diagnosed as terminally ill with no more than 6 months to live, mentally capable of making the decision, and free from coercion to do so. Well, the bill must pass several more rounds of intense scrutiny from parliamentarians before it can become law. But the issue sparked a passionate national debate, with voices from different perspectives raising matters of ethics, faith and justice. At the same time, philosophers were preparing to cross continents for a conference in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, to discuss quality of life. In this episode, we'll consider attitudes to life and death from an ethical, practical and philosophical point of view. Dame Esther Rantzen is a celebrated British journalist and activist whose TV show, That's Life, ran for over 20 years, reaching audiences of more than 20 million viewers. Her campaigns have helped save children from abuse and the elderly from neglect. But now in her 80s, she's become a prominent figure in the campaign for assisted dying after revealing she's received a terminal cancer diagnosis. Her daughter and fellow campaigner, Rebecca Wilcox, joins me now. Rebecca Wilcox, it's really good to have some time with you, and it's sad that we're talking under these circumstances, but it's a very important subject. So for people like myself, we grew up seeing your mother, and half the country pretty much tuned into her every week on TV. And she was known as quite a staunch campaigner. Now, she bettered a lot of lives through those campaigns, and it seems she's taken on this one last campaign. I think you described it as her last campaign at your peril, something like that.
Yes, I said she doesn't want this to be known as her final campaign because there's still life in the old bird yet, is what she would say. And I would possibly get smacked over the head for saying that. Obviously, she doesn't agree with violence.
Now, the world got to know about Dame Esther's cancer when she revealed it on an interview that she had terminal cancer. And she also revealed that she was going to Dignitas, or signing up with Dignitas, the service in Switzerland that assists dying. Now, as your family would have already been aware, it seemed that her considerations were not so much for herself, but more about the impact it would have on the people around her, the people that she loved, perhaps facing prosecution for being involved in any way, as is the case with the law. So how did you and your family respond to your mother's decision?
It was an interesting one because whilst I've always been aware of her feelings towards end-of-life care and choice at the end of your life, I had no idea that she had signed up to Dignitas until she revealed it on a podcast. And I think a journalist rang me and asked me for a comment, which is pretty standard for growing up with my parents being in the public eye as they were. And so it wasn't a massive surprise, but it was, and it's in keeping with everything I know about her, but it was weirdly shocking because I felt that she wasn't near the end of her life. I felt that the treatment was going well. I love living in denial. It's not healthy. It's not good for you. I would never recommend it, but it helps me get through the day just to pretend that everything is okay. And the fact that she had gone about this with meticulous care and sorted out a future for herself that wouldn't hurt us showed how seriously she was taking this illness. I like to think of her as immortal and indomitable, and I think that was a bit of a shocking moment for me. I felt the rug pulled out.
There was also a massive reaction in the British media. There was a huge reaction with the public. Was Dame Esther surprised? Was she energized, or perhaps concerned at being part of this debate?
I think she accidentally fell into this debate and then realized it was meant to be. She sort of has an ability for touching on the zeitgeist. So I would say that happened when she did Child Watch, and out of that came Childline, the helpline for children. And when she wrote an article about loneliness, she received so many letters in response to that she set up Silverline, which was a helpline for older people who were feeling similar feelings. And then she talked about this, and it was absolutely the right time for the country to start considering it again. It had been 2015 when it was last debated in Parliament. It had sort of plateaued. And I think she lit a fire under it. And once she realized that this decision that she made for herself could help other people, that's always been her goal. She's never done anything for herself at the detriment for other people. She suddenly realized this was a subject that needed talking about. It needed airing. We need to talk about end-of-life care. Even if you disagree with the assisted dying bill, we need to talk about what happens at the end of your life, because sadly, we are all going to die. So your family need to know what you want, what care you want, what choices you want to make. And that's what this bill is about. It's about giving you further choices in that matter.
Rebecca, your mother's not known for doing anything half-heartedly. And apparently she contacted every member of parliament in the UK government before the debate. Is that the case?
Oh, yes, absolutely. She knew that she wasn't physically able to go to the debate. She sent me in her stead, and I sat at the top and sat on my hands and tried not to shout at people when I assumed that they were saying something that I disagreed with or she disagreed with me. And because she couldn't be there, she sent this heartfelt letter filled with comment and fact that she really hoped they would sit and listen to, because that's what she wanted. She wanted everybody in the room to listen to the other side, regardless of the point of view that you come into the room with. Listen to the other side and then make a choice. We know that the public are majority in favour of changing the rules around assisted dying. We just wanted that reflected in the room.
Now, Rebecca, your father, Desmond Wilcox, is also a renowned journalist and filmmaker. And I gather both he and your mother had touched on this subject in documentaries in the past. Tell us about that.
They were trailblazers. They would go where subjects hadn't gone before. They didn't mind talking about the things that were difficult. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they covered this subject. Most recently, Mum made a series called How to Have a Good Death. And it was a really interesting eye-opener for her. And I think paved the way for this campaign, because she saw people suffer in a way that was not palatable, for want of a better word, and could not be helped by palliative care. She saw people's shunts fall out, and she saw people's morphine drop off, and she saw people's pain surpass the opioid barrier. And I think that created a deep-seated belief in her that she did not want to go that way, that she wanted something far more peaceful. And my father felt the same way. He had a DNR, he had a do not resuscitate, that was very clear. And I remember in the hospital when he was dying, they were trying to resuscitate him, and Mom was screaming at me on the phone because she had popped home to change her outfit. Not out of it, that sounds ridiculous. She'd popped home to refresh herself because we'd been there a few hours, and unfortunately she wasn't there as he started crashing. So she's screaming at me on the phone that he has a DNR, he has a DNR. And I wasn't able to, or I couldn't, some reason it felt wrong for me to stop the medical process, but actually that's what he wanted. And I really hope that I would be brave enough to do that now. But he never wanted to have a catastrophic brain injury from lack of oxygen, which was what was happening, and therefore live in a vegetative state. He wanted to have a good death, which is what the Health and Social Care Select Committee report talked about. And Mum absolutely echoed that. So their work throughout their lives always touched on difficult subjects and brilliant people talking about difficult things. And I'm not surprised they ended up with the decisions they ended up with.
It was a very difficult situation, of course, you found yourself in, and there are many perspectives on this subject, with some people very, very heavily opposed to it. They see it as assisted suicide, rather than just assisted dying. And I wonder, your mother would have heard a number of these arguments. Was she ever swayed by some of these viewpoints? Did it affect her in any way?
She has listened. She has listened. What she asked of the MPs to listen to her point of view, she has listened to other people. Otherwise, she is not the fair and rational woman that we know and love. She absolutely understands that people have differing points of view, that some people see that there's a sanctity of life, that some people see that there could be a coercive nature to this, that vulnerable elements of our society could be put at risk. But she and I have both looked through all the evidence and know that choice, according to the bill that has been set out, has an amazing set of safeguards around it. The safeguards are the cornerstone of this bill. At the moment, there aren't safeguards. At the moment, we're sort of living in a weird Wild West because nobody knows what to do and the law is a mess. So things can happen without regulation, whereas this would bring in regulation and legislation, and people would be able to monitor it very closely. I mean, it asks for the person that's asking to have an assisted death to apply 8 separate times. And now those 8 separate times are scrutinized by doctors and lawyers or judges, depending upon how it proceeds with the committee stages. So there was no way that we didn't listen to other people's point of view, but the thing that kept coming back to us was, this is choice, and faith is always choice. And I have many family members who are strong believers in the sanctity of life, but they would never believe that my mum should live in suffering and had a prolonged existence just because of their faith.
Actually, you raise an interesting point there, Rebecca, and having spoken to people who are opposed to the bill, and you yourself will know the arguments very well, I'm sure, that issue of being coerced by others prematurely to end one's life, or even perhaps self-coercion came up. The idea that people might be guilty enough and feel that they need to end their lives because of pressure and burden they might put on others, came up also in the debate. And I wonder, did that issue ever come up among your family members?
What I would say about that is that there was an MP that stood up during the debate, and he said, this is not life or death, this is death or death. It was such a clear, bold statement that I hadn't heard before. I've heard people talk about this is not ending life, this is shortening death, but it makes it really clear that this is for terminal patients, people who have 6 months, 12 months left to live. It is not for somebody that is considered a burden on society. What a revolting phrase that is. Anybody that thinks they are a burden on society needs to have an adjusted view, because we need to value everybody, regardless of whatever supposed cost they may have. Everybody has a right to life. Kit Malthouse, the MP, said that we are not a nation of granny killers. And I think that is true. I think we, in the main, generally, absolutely adore our elders and respect them and look after them.
It's interesting, Rebecca, you raised that issue of safeguards, the safeguards that are there already, and the fact some are worried of the bill, allowing the scope to widen. And I wonder, if you could see any other potential safeguards that might really add another lock to the idea that the bill couldn't go any wider.
Well, I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not very well versed in politics. I've come to this very green, and it's been a very steep education for me in how contrary points of view can cause such emotive arguments. I've had a lot of threats against my life, against my family's safety, just because I believe in choice at the end of this world. So at the end of your life. So it's an interesting one for me that you talk about safeguards, when the people that are throwing around the violent terms are usually on the opposite side to me. We turn up to every debate, every campaign, every rally. I'm alongside a campaign called Dignity in Dying, and that's exactly how we try and proceed at all these rallies, with dignity, with compassion, with empathy, and we're hugging each other and we're chatting to each other. And I'm alongside people who are really suffering from very serious terminal diagnoses, including this wonderful woman called Sophie, who has stage 4 terminal breast cancer and is allergic to opioids. So at the end of her life, she sees nothing but pain. She cannot have any pain relief. So how does the gentle death of palliative care work for someone like her? With the safeguards that we want, I think this is the most safe bill. In fact, there have been criticisms of it for having too many safeguards. I think at the moment, with the country not decided, with a bit of a rift going on, even though the majority are in favour of it, I think it's good to proceed with this level of safety at this time.
Referring to the stage where things are right now, you indicated your mother was unable to go for the first vote. You were there. How did both of you and your mother, react to the outcome?
It was so strange being there for the debate. I mean, it was a phenomenal moment that I will never, ever forget. It's an extraordinary place, as I'm sure you know, and it was filled to the rafters, which on a Friday is apparently quite unusual. There was not an ounce of seating left. And at the end of this very, very detailed debate that lasted 5 hours, and everyone said that was really short, I'm not sure I could have stood another 2 hours of it. But I know that there were more people that wanted to stand up and speak. But at the end of the debate, when they all went out to vote and the speaker shouted out the results, and then there was silence. And I looked across to someone who was sat on the opposite side, who I knew supported my point of view, and he put 2 thumbs up. And I was so relieved he did, because the silence meant that I wasn't sure what had happened, because usually there's a hurrah from whoever wins. But it's such a serious subject. And at the end of the day, if we win, or, it doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like the ability to choose has been given to you to die. That is not something you cheer. Obviously, it's not. That's why it was taken so seriously. So I leapt out of the room and ran down the stairs. There is absolutely no phone signal anywhere in the Houses of Parliament. So I had to run to the river to get through to Mum, where I spoke to her, and I felt dizzy and sick and confused, and she and I were both echoing this. It's brilliant, it's amazing, thank goodness it's got through this stage, but wow, there's a lot of work left to do. Goodness, there were a lot of people that were putting up barriers to it already, and and then she said to me, "Oh, I feel like I have to live for the next one now." I said, "Yes, of course you do, but you don't have to live for the next debate. You have to live forever for us, your family, and maybe think about the debate."
Rebecca, you said you talked about how your mother reacted when you called her when you got out the Houses of Parliament to the River Thames to get a signal. And she said, the next one is coming up. So, of course, I guess you both recognize that at this stage, it could be passed, it could be amended, it could even fail. Having played such a big part in the campaign, doesn't your mother want to kind of take a step back and rest and enjoy the rest of her life?
I tell you, she says to me, "I'm so bored with talking about dying." So I think she probably does, but I also think that she won't, because that's not the sort of person that she is. I don't think she'll let go of this. I think, we've both received so many messages and letters and emails from families that are going through very similar situations to us, that don't have the privilege of being able to afford the £15,000 to fly off to Switzerland, that are facing whatever will happen here and have no way out, or who have been through it before, who have either been to Switzerland or who have come across a loved one who is attempting suicide or has a botched suicide attempt. There's so many awful stories that are rolling around our heads, and so many people that we know are dependent upon this bill, that I don't think there's any way that we could stop now. The next stage is very difficult. It's the committee stage. The bill will be gone through line by line by line, and I can only hope it gets through. It's weird how our country is so recalcitrant on this topic, whereas we are leaders in so many other areas of health and social care. So I just hope that we are a bit more open to another way of looking at this.
Your mother mentioned in a recent interview that you'll be hosting the family Christmas event this year. Assuming she is able to come, what will Christmas with Esther Ransom be like this year? And what memories do you have of Christmases together?
Yes, I'm going to be hosting my mum and my sister at some point over the Christmas period. They're going to come and stay. We haven't worked out the logistics yet, but I'm definitely, whenever that is, we'll have a massive turkey. I think I've ordered 3. I don't know how much turkey one person can eat, but her plate is going to be full. She doesn't have much of an appetite at the moment, but she's going to have every single trimming, every single type of stuffing, many types of Brussels sprouts, because we have quite a few opinions on how those should be cooked. Christmas with Esther is always fun. It's magical. She's naughty. She's brilliant. She's fun. She loves games. So we're going to play all sorts of games. I've got some fantastic new board games, competitive and not so. Anyone that takes her on in Scrabble, good luck to you. I have never won against her, but it's just going to be lovely. And I've bought her some excessively luxurious presents, which I hope she won't mind, and many gorgeous fluffy slippers. So please don't tell her I've done that too. And I'm decorating absolutely every surface of my house. There is not one vertical, horizontal, diagonal that isn't covered in glitter and gold. So it's a bit much, but I love it.
I'm sure, Rebecca Wilcox, that pretty much everyone is wishing you and your family and your mother especially a wonderful Christmas celebration this year. Your mother, for people of my generation, I can say almost unanimously was a national treasure, has been a national treasure. And it's incredibly impressive that she's still doing so much to this stage. So more power to you, more power to her. And I wish you well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I'll pass on the message.
Polls show that around 2/3 of British people supported the idea of legalising some form of assisted dying. But it's the members of Parliament who will ultimately decide whether and in what form such a law can proceed. The bill was brought before the House of Commons by the Labour Party MP Kim Leadbeater, who only entered politics 3 years ago after her sister Jo Cox MP was murdered. My next guest is also a Labour MP, but he voted against the bill. Barry Gardner's history of service spans more than a quarter of a century, and as he told me, his decision was made after much soul-searching. Barry Gardner, thank you very much for joining the show. Now, when you entered Parliament in 1997 as a young MP, what sense did you have you'd be involved in debates of such importance to the national conscience?
I think anyone who thinks about going into politics, national politics, has to realize that there will be times when they are considering issues which really are about life or death. In my own parliamentary career, I've had that on a number of occasions. We've had, obviously, debates on war. We've had debates previously on assisted dying. So it's something which everyone who goes into politics at that level really should have at the forefront of their mind, and they should have thought very deeply about it. And I think that was one of the features of the recent debate that we had. It was a very thoughtful debate.
You voted against the bill and spoke in the debate. What key points did you want to make?
I think it's important that we recognize that when we're legislating, we are not simply expressing our own personal preference. And this was the fundamental internal conflict that I had with myself, because I could envisage myself being in that situation as outlined in this bill, with perhaps 6 months yet to live, with a terminal disease, and depending on the nature of that disease, perhaps wanting to avail myself of what this law would propose, which is to be able to have an assisted death. So at a personal level, I could see that. And I also listened very carefully to the stories of many of my colleagues and some of my constituents whose family members had been in that position, but hadn't been able to avail themselves of an assisted death. Some who'd taken their own life, but hadn't been able to have their final goodbyes with their family, because that would have implicated their family in assisting suicide, which is a criminal offense. So I had to think very hard about, was it my role to enact a law which would certainly bring comfort and relief to those people, or was it my role as a parliamentarian to pass legislation for the whole of society? And my fear was that if we passed the legislation that would undeniably bring that comfort and relief for so many, but I believe it would also have jeopardized those people who were, yes, in the situation at the end of their life with 6 months yet to live, but who thought, am I too much of a burden on my family? Should I just now opt for an early death? Is my living for another 6 months in this care home or with this care support going to eat so much up of the inheritance that my grandchildren might have on my death that I'm denying them their inheritance? And those are considerations that nobody at the end of their life should have to take into account.
Now, you're referring to guilt.
Misplaced guilt, because there is no guilt in living. You know, you're not guilty for being alive. You are a valued, a treasured human being. And where we lose our capacity to see each other as that, then our society really has changed fundamentally.
But Mr. Gardner, in terms of not having somewhere to go, there are people, such as the famous British broadcaster Esther Rantzen, who's in her mid-80s and suffering from lung cancer, who said if she doesn't have the option in the UK, she'll go to Switzerland, to Dignitas, an organisation that does offer assisted dying. So by not giving them the option in the UK, aren't you simply driving them out?
Well, no, it doesn't force them out, but what it does, unfortunately, and here I feel this very keenly, the point that you make, because as Esther Rantzen wrote to me, as she did to many MPs, and her own witness, her own testimony of her situation was very powerful. And she made the point, I have the luxury, I am wealthy enough to be able to go to Switzerland, but there are people who are not. And therefore, at the moment, as the law stands, as a rich person, I can avail myself of the remedy that I want. I can exercise the choice that I wish to make, but a poor person cannot. And that's a very powerful argument. But as I say, I don't think it overrides the responsibility that I certainly felt to legislate for everyone in society, and not just for those who felt themselves in that particular situation as wanting to have the assisted death.
It's interesting to note that this debate comes at a time when Britain has evolved into a multicultural and multi-faith society with representations of those groups in Parliament too. And I wonder, when it comes to religion and faith, in many cases assisted dying is seen as suicide, which is considered a sin, how those MPs were able to rationalise the debate in terms of their own beliefs.
The great thing about the debate was that it was incredibly respectful. No matter which side of the debate you were on, everybody listened with care and attention to what was being said. And obviously many people of faith were influenced by their faith. But that was why this was made a vote of conscience. It was not a whipped vote. It was not one that, and quite rightly, it should not be something that you say, oh, well, we have a manifesto commitment on something as deeply important to one's own sense of who one is, because this is one of the most deep ethical questions that one can have, and it was right that it was a free vote. So I think religion did not actually ostensibly play a part in the debate. People weren't saying this is prohibited by God, but obviously their own sense of where they stood in the debate probably was. But they then had to construct their arguments in a way that appealed to the wider audience who may not have shared their religious beliefs.
Supporters of the bill, such as MP Kim Leadbeater, point to the safeguards they tried to build in, such as 2 doctors, a judge, 6 months of life expectancy, and heavy jail sentences for those who might ill-advise or coerce someone into assisted dying. So you had talked about wanting another level of assurance. What would that be?
I think there was a recognition, not just from myself, but from others, that there needed to be additional safeguards. For example, the situation of the judge signing it off, that is really a technical formality. It's not there's no investigative powers that the judge has. He simply has to check whether 2 doctors have agreed. I'm afraid that my view on the way in which the medical profession might operate in this is that it is not even doctors who spoke in the debate accepted that 6 months was a very movable feast. Sometimes they give a prognosis, and that prognosis is entirely wrong. I think there was a concern that we would develop into two sets of doctors, those who were known to favor assisted dying and those who were not. And if you wanted that, you simply went to the ones who would sign you off without too much questioning. And I think that is, it was a safeguard, but I don't think it was an adequate safeguard.
Well, Mr. Gardner, the House of Commons is often known as a bit of a bullpit with impolite yelling and jeering, whereas many people describe this debate as very respectful and deeply moving. It seems to be quite a contrast from the usual scenes.
Yes, it really was, and goodness knows, I wish many more debates were conducted in that tone. I have to tell you, I think what made it very evident was there was one member of Parliament who entirely misjudged the mood of Parliament. I won't name who it was, but he sought to make a political point in his contribution. He sought to make a political point about the government's recent announcement of winter fuel payments and the taking away of the winter fuel payments for people who were not on the lowest band of benefit. And the whole House groaned. It was a gut groan. It was a, oh, and it seemed that all of Parliament, whichever side you were on, were saying, what are you doing? You're trying to turn this into a political debate. It's not. It's bigger than that, and we have to be bigger than that. And in that sense, I really think Parliament showed itself at its best because it was respectful. It was a debate which was characterized by listening and trying to respond seriously to the points that each other were making.
Yes, as you say, many people did describe this as parliamentary debate at its best. And I wonder what lessons could be learned from this, especially at a time when people around the world are starting to lose faith in politics.
Yes. Well, the obvious thing is let's have more free votes. Let's have more conscience votes. And perhaps MPs, instead of feeling that they have to troop through the lobbies after their whips, will think more deeply about the consequences of the legislation that they're passing. So I wouldn't like people to get the impression that the Commons is all, shallow and point scoring. It's not. But certainly this debate, I think, did the House proud. And even though I was on the losing side, I recognize that probably the majority of the British population, certainly in the polling that's been taken, were on the side of the bill. They wanted to see the bill go forward. And in that way, I have to respect democracy and hope that I'm wrong and that the fears that I have for this bill will not come to pass.
Sir, I understand that your parents died, sadly, while you were still very young. And I wonder if you believe that palliative care has sufficiently improved since then to be a viable alternative to the thought of assisted dying.
Look, I think everybody in that debate was clear that we need to improve palliative care in this country. Palliative care can be wonderful, and I've seen some marvelous examples in my own constituency and in my own personal life. My own father, as you mentioned, he died of esophageal cancer, which is a really ghastly way to die. And so I think we all understand that we need better palliative care. But I don't want to make the mistake of thinking that palliative care can alleviate everything. People in hospices do wonderful jobs, absolutely wonderful jobs. But I do understand why there are some situations for some people where assisted death does seem the only viable option. And that obviously is what the majority of members of the House of Commons felt.
Well, this moment has been compared with other parliamentary debates on sensitive matters such as same-sex marriage, abortion, the repeal of the death penalty. And I wonder how it sits alongside debates that Parliament has to conduct on economic and social and defence matters.
Oh, gosh. It's a very different thing. And that is why I think it has to be a vote of conscience, where every member of parliament has the freedom to examine themselves, examine who they are, and examine who they feel the country ought to be, and to do the best for everybody in society. I often think of the writings of John Stuart Mill, the great libertarian Enlightenment philosopher of the 19th century. And he said a very strange thing, or people thought it was very strange. He said the reason that he was against the universal suffrage, the universal vote, was he believed that if everybody had the vote, then, and in those days it was only men, he said, men would come to regard the vote as an expression of their own private preference rather than as an expression of their public responsibility. Now, I think I disagree with his premise, because I think people always did use the vote as an expression of their own private preference. But it's a really fundamental principle that I think legislators need to always keep in mind. They're not legislating for what they would like. They're not legislating for what they think would benefit them or their particular group of people, or any particular group of people. They're there to legislate for the whole of society. And I think if we lose sight of that, then we lose really something that's very fundamental to our democracy. So these debates are very different. The debates you mentioned, ethical debates about the nature of life, the way in which our society regards life, when it begins, when it should end, how it should be conducted. Fundamental questions, very different from the education budget, very different from the issues of work and pensions and employment and industry, which we're doing all the time. But when you get that many serious people in a room taking the issue seriously, one has to hope that we arrive at a conclusion which does fit with our society and which does ultimately benefit the whole of our community.
Barry Gardiner, thank you very much for taking the time to give us your perspective on this debate. Thank you, sir.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Barry Gardiner ended our conversation by describing how he finds philosophy to be a helpful resource when considering decisions on important issues, including matters of life and death. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles, about 6,000 kilometers from London, a global gathering of philosophers took place in Saudi Arabia. Quality of life was the main theme of the Riyadh International Philosophy Conference, featuring a diverse group of prominent thinkers. I was keen to hear their thoughts on the issues that were being debated in Britain. Dr. Joseph Cohen, I'm very happy to have a chance to chat with you. What's interesting is we're here at a philosophy conference in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia looking at something called quality of life. When it comes to quality of life, where does the whole concept of assisted dying fit in?
Excellent question. First of all, thank you very much. Assisted dying. A very famous, important philosopher, Martin Heidegger, wrote in Being and Time, 1927, wrote that no one can take dying away from the person. No one can take someone's dying away from him or her.
A right to die.
That is, the experience of dying is always unsubstitutable. It cannot be taken away from anyone. My dying will be my own dying. Your dying will be your own dying, and no one will be able to take that away from you or I. So the experience of dying is a singular experience, right? The right to die is the right to live through that experience. That is the right to confront the experience of dying. I believe that this confrontation is a confrontation of human existence. Human existence needs to confront this dying because in this confrontation, it shows the possibility for the subject to project himself or herself into life.
But what's happened, Dr. Cohen, is that it's all become a legal matter now.
Right.
Not a philosophical one.
Right.
And that's where the complications come in. Who has the right to be involved, whether it's family members, friends, whatever? What right does the person who wants to die have? It's a very sensitive topic, and I can understand it because it brings in ethics, religion, and everything else. But when it comes to the idea of this debate, what should be the angles we as a society, global society, should look at?
I think we should definitely entertain the possibility of respecting human finitude. I think one of the major challenges of our time is to confront the finitude of our human existence. And in a certain manner, I think a lot of the problems of our epoch are linked to the idea that we can think beyond human finitude. We can think ourselves as almost infinite. I think we need to refocus on the possibility for human rationality to truly look at what the meaning of life is, what the quality of life is, in the horizon of finitude. And in this sense, death, although it is the absolute master, to speak like Hegel, for example, German philosopher, death is the absolute master. Death may not be that which is a radical interruption of humanity. On the contrary, it may precisely be the revelator of that which projects humanity. You see?
I guess the argument is death may be inevitable for all of us, but who should have a choice on when that event occurs?
But you see, even that question, although I understand why we're posing it, even that question is impossible to answer. Death is impossible to determine. Death is one's own, and yet at the same time, it's not one's own. I will be given my death, even if it's my own. You will be given your death, and it will only be yours, but it's not yours to have.
Let's pretend you're a lawyer defending someone who went through assisted dying.
Yeah.
How are you going to explain all this in court?
Yeah, it's obvious that the way I'm seeking to think the problem of dying is far removed from the idea of law, from the legal apparatus. Because I make a very sharp distinction between the law and justice. Perhaps being just towards death, towards the question of death, involves or engages our thinking beyond the law. That is, outside the sphere of law.
I think the UK, which is debating this right now, is in a very difficult position because, of course, it's combining religion, philosophy, ethics, and legality. If it's not too personal a question, would you opt for assisted dying?
Very, very complex question. Myself, and speaking strictly for myself, yes, I would. I think that confronting the question of death, confronting one's dying, is the most radical human experience. And in a certain manner, the courage it takes to confront that experience needs to be given to human finitude, needs to be allowed for in human experience. So yes, I would certainly give each and every one of us as human existence, as existing humans, the possibility to confront this experience of dying.
And yet, it's seen as a sin in so many societies.
Yes.
How do we rationalize that?
Well, I think yeah, it definitely is seen as a sin, but I think we can understand a certain manner of thinking the religious, even the ethical, in relation to human experience, which would also involve the idea of confronting the experience of dying.
Professor Robert Bernasconi, really it's a pleasure to be sitting here with you. And I'm going to start by asking you about the debate that's going on in the UK right now regarding assisted dying. The reason being is that raises so many issues. And again, from a philosophical perspective, there's the ethics, there's religion, there's legality. What's your take on what's happening?
That's a very difficult question. I personally, I'm not attached to life. And I'd be perfectly happy to die right now. I mean, you probably like me to finish the interview.
Last 20 minutes.
Yes, I'll do my best. But so, for me, life is a wonderful thing. And yet, I don't have that sense. I have a sense of responsibility that I'm taking up space, I'm doing so on and so forth. Now, I entirely understand all the back and forth about the issues, that people could be pressurized to take death rather than continue when they don't want to. And that sounds like a horrible thing. But I also understand people who are in pain. So it's just a question of trying to find arrangements so that people can be confident in the system.
I can say honestly, in 10,000 plus interviews over the years, I've never had anyone say they could be happy to die right now. I mean, I've heard people say they're not scared of death. Mm-hmm. They're not worried about, death. It's an inevitability. But I'm just baffled. Sorry, I'm going to delve into this a bit, but just ask, where does this detachment from life come?
Well, I've just had a wonderful life. I mean, I'm
there's
so
a lot more,
blessed.
Hopefully, isn't there?
Well, I'm 74 years old, so not that much more.
74 is young.
Yeah, to some people. I mean, no doubt if I do live to 94, I'll think about when I was 74 and think, oh, I was young back in those days. But no, I'm perfectly happy with the idea that I've had a great life. I think I've done some good things and some bad things, and I just don't want to ruin it. Aristotle says, you can only tell whether a person was happy, had eudaimonia is his word, after they're dead. And right now, I think I would be on the plus side. But maybe I'll go off and do something wrong and wish I died before this interview if I say the wrong thing today.
Professor Fausto Frisopi, thank you so much for spending some time with us. The big debate currently in society, certainly in the UK, is this concept of assisted dying. And what that does is it raises a lot of questions about what ethics are. From a philosopher's perspective, how do we set ethical boundaries?
So the problem is, in my view, don't fall in eugenetics. We already know from many decades ago. The problem is assisting dying is voluntarily or willingly asked from the patient. Why not? There is no ethic boundaries. But the ethic boundary will be strong or too strong when the society decide when is the case or not. And precisely where the point on which philosophy have something to say is if there is the case or not. It's not a matter of taxonomy if there is if it's the case or not, but a matter of general conception of life and when a life is worthy to live to the end, even with sickness, even with handicaps, and so on and so on. In my view, the extreme boundary and the extreme danger is the eugenetics. When a society settle taxonomies to say, okay, we can intervene for assisting that.
Let me get on to what has been the subject of this philosophy conference, quality of life, because that's actually the precursor to this debate.
Yes.
And I guess it comes down to how we judge quality of life. Now, there's obviously medical illness and serious conditions that warrant a different level of discussion. There's quality of life in terms of what people perceive as wealth or capability, financial capability. What is quality of life in your terms?
There's a very sharp distinction in the history of philosophy between quantity and quality. Quantity, we all know, quantity is opulence, a mass of goods, and quality is something quite different. I think quality is the capacity to reveal what is singular in life, what is non-negotiable in life, what is radically singular and particular. Now, I believe that each and every one of us must think that problem of singularity through, must think the relationship between what is singular and what is qualitative. Now, if you ask me as a philosopher, I will tell you that what is most important in this qualitative ideal is time, temporality, how to use our time, how to think through the utilization of our time, of our temporality as existence, but also our time with others, our time that we share with others in our communities, in our families, even in regards to our country, etc.
My mother, as a personal note, my mother went through years of Parkinson's disease, and at one point she said to me, as she was losing her physical capabilities, her mind was still sharp, she said, "This is not living, it's existence." That resonated with me. So how do we determine what a person is entitled to in terms of quality of life?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because you're marking the distinction between life and existence. Now, perhaps I should make something quite obvious. Existence, the word existence, means actually to step out of oneself, transcend oneself. It comes from the existence, it means to come out of oneself. I'm very attached to this idea. I'm very attached to this idea because I believe that human life must constantly and incessantly transcend itself. One must transcend itself, out of itself, into a betterment of oneself, into the qualitative ideal of a temporality that stretches out. The main problem for me when I think about the idea of quality of life is that we often reduce temporality. We often reduce temporality to a particular goal. I want such and such a thing. I want to achieve such and such a job. I want to achieve such and such a situation. We restrict temporality to succeeding in a particular goal or a particular appropriation of a goal. I would rather, and remaining faithful to this idea of existing, I would like us to think quality of life as stretching out time.
This leads me almost perfectly onto where society has gone in terms of quality of life. I mean, many people, myself sometimes also, bemoan the fact that we've become so short-term in our thinking. We have lost, as society, our understanding of the difference between need and want.
Yes.
And it's driven very much by want, so much more than need. And that kind of detaches us from the real needs on this planet, between societies and cultures and so on. So when we think of quality of life in those terms, how can we bring ourselves back to understanding these differences? When you have a conference looking at the quality of life, how do you get people to consider this and not think short term and materialistically?
Yeah, no, I think I mean you're putting your finger on a very important topic, and I think a topic that will be discussed throughout our conference. That is, how can we instill in our lives, in the quality of our lives, the possibility to invent or to think outside the box, to be very pragmatic in my speech. That is, think outside the box, invent outside the determined modalities of our thinking. you were asking me about where has society gone. I feel today, politically, sociologically, anthropologically, even geographically, I feel that we have reached a point where our humanity is extremely determined in the simple repetition of inherited ideas. I believe what we need is to reinvent these inherited ideas.
But what are these inherited ideas based on?
They're based on a tradition, and I'm all for the enhancement of our tradition, but I'm also thinking that our humanity, and this is why I'm so attached to this project here in Riyadh, is that we are incessantly seeking to reinvent our tradition. That is, take our tradition and our different traditions. It's an international conference. People from all walks of life, not only philosophers, scientists, not only people from the Middle East, but also people from all over the world are coming to Riyadh to take what our traditions have given us and invent a commonality of humanity. And this is what I feel and fear we have lost in many of our societies. The power to invent and reinvent what we receive.
The conference, the Riyadh International Philosophy Conference, the theme for this year has been quality of life. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, where this fits into what you might define as quality of life.
Well, in my talk, I talked about how the quality of life has become the slogan in well-being league tables put out by the World Health Organization and other similar organizations. And I just feel that they have entirely missed the point. That too easily this becomes an instrument for governments to be competing against each other, to be higher up in the league table. They're more likely to go higher up in the league table if they're keeping the middle class happy rather than addressing poverty or systemic issues like climate change. And so I just think that the whole emphasis is wrong. And so in my talk, I was talking about poverty and hunger and why I would prefer to see that as the issue, and global poverty. It shouldn't be countries competing against each other to be better than the other one. We should be trying to pull up the people who need the most help.
So when it comes to the term quality of life, what's your definition of it?
Oh, I don't have a definition. I'm not that kind of philosopher, thankfully. So I just think the phrase, which basically, not many people know this, but it gained currency because President Lyndon Johnson used it in a talk he gave in Madison Gardens.
Yeah.
Thank you, yes, in 1964. And then all these economists went off and thought, oh, that's what we should be talking about, not GDP, but quality of life. And so that's why they tried to measure it and so on. But I think that, again, it's always going to be different for different people and different cultures. And I think trying to make this a competition is a mistake.
Do you find the world of philosophy is a shrinking one?
Oh, that's a very provocative, in its own sense, it's a very provocative question. At times, I do feel philosophy is shrinking. That is, I do feel philosophy is becoming ever more so specialized and structured only on the repetition of its own tradition, which is an extremely rich tradition. And certainly we need that form of specialization in universities and research centers. And I'm a professional philosopher, so I'm not going to criticize that. But at the same time, I do feel that what philosophy really needs and how philosophy can really help, because we always say philosophy cannot help our society, they're abstract and they're living in their ivory towers in Cambridge and Oxford or wherever, but where philosophy can really truly help is to develop and deploy in what is common, what is to reveal in what is common, what is singular. That is from where we can reinvent ourselves. I think philosophy has a task today to insist on the reinvention of our humankind.
Is the problem that philosophy is considered elite? Is that the issue?
No, it's one of the problems. It's one of the problems, and I think philosophy has a great responsibility in that elite manner of appearing. And I think philosophy must, in a way, come down from that elite status and become much closer to our everyday life. But at the same time, I would never want philosophy to let go of its radicality, and its radicality is what? Its radicality is, again, the possibility for the subject to transcend itself, for the human subject to transcend itself, to become other than itself, to reinvent itself.
Do you, as a philosopher, often change your ideas, your philosophies?
Constantly. And I think, if I may be a little bit provocative even about philosophy, I think one of the great dangers of philosophy and of philosophy as a discipline is to always pretend that coherence is the sole motivator for human beings. I think there is a value to uncoherence, to the possibility of constantly and incessantly changing to adapt to our singular existential situations. The situation of 1968, is not the same situation in 2024. We need to have not only evolved from 68 to 2024, but rethink the very concepts that were used in 68, rethink those concepts for 2024. That means constantly and incessantly change.
Do you think there has been a change in this global society that's now being created by the internet, the World Wide Web, interconnectivity at a global level? Is there a change in philosophy? Is there a better exchange of understanding of ideas?
Yeah, I would say the culture interact when there is, at first and foremost, commercial exchange. So the beginning of the Renaissance, the rise of Columbus, and the rise of the companies to the east, the Jesuit company already increased the knowledge from the west to the east, and so on and so on. Now we live in a globalized world. This is my matter of study, in a complex world. And in this case, of course, technologies can help to a dialogue. But I will say as a platform, not as a form of dialogue. The dialogue must be established person to person in such conferences, in long dialogues, not with smart messages and all what the platforms provide to us.
Thinking of different cultures, is philosophy as a subject, is it universal, or is it very much divided along cultural lines and, I guess religious lines, ethnic lines?
Well, obviously there's been a huge variety of philosophies, and I'm not a mainstream philosopher. I've done quite well. I got a job, but I'm not one of those people who is trying to conform to whatever the fashion is. So quite honestly, I think a lot of current philosophy is not very interesting. I think it's geared towards an academic audience. It doesn't know how to get beyond that. It's geared towards trying to publish as many articles as possible. So I think philosophy has lost its way. And one of the luxuries of having a job with tenure is that I can do what I want.
What would be your version of what philosophy should be then?
I think it should be trying to hear voices from more different people. And that's why I think that to a certain extent, what we call Western philosophy is somewhat played out. at least in terms of what it's become. I'm not denying the wonderful classics that I enjoy studying. So I'm not one of these people against the great books, as it were. But I do think that if we could hear more from people from India, from Saudi Arabia, from Algeria, wherever, I just think that that is what will refresh and renew philosophy, because it's coming from different conditions, different contexts, people have different intuitions depending on where they're brought up.
Well, my intention would be to speak with you a lot longer, but I'm going to ask you a final question as we are running out of time. And that would be, is philosophy as a concept, as a source of inspiration and kind of debate in society, is it dying?
I want to make a very firm distinction here. I think if I look at academic philosophy as it's practiced in many elite institutions, I would say it deserves to die. If you look at the issues that ordinary people have that we need to introduce or reintroduce back into philosophy, then it'll never die.
Professor Robert Bernasconi, what a pleasure. Thank you.
I enjoyed it too.
Thank you. Professor Versopi, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you too.
Thank you, sir. Well, Dr. Joseph Cohen, what a pleasure. You've provoked a lot of thought here, I hope, with the people watching. Certainly have with me. Real pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Some thoughts there on how the ancient tradition of philosophy can be applied to very current issues that are being passionately debated in some parts of the world today. Thanks to all my guests for their respectful, considered and sensitive contributions they brought to this episode. I'm Riz Khan from me and the team. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture. The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and with the holiday season upon us, we've decided to take a look back at some of the highlights from the last few weeks. Hello and welcome to the programme. We begin with the news that the French Prime Minister Michel Barnier officially handed in his resignation during a meeting with the French President Emmanuel Macron earlier on today at the Élysée Palace. Well, Barnier's minority government collapsed on Wednesday due to a no-confidence vote over a controversial budget proposal, making him the first Prime Minister in 60 years to be removed by such a vote just 3 months into his term. Well, France's parliament is deeply divided and no fresh elections are permitted until July of next year. Well, for more analysis, we can speak now to the French Senator Nathalie Goulet. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. It looks like France is in a state of political and financial chaos. How has it come to this point?
Well, you know that last June, the president decided to recall parliamentary election. And as a result of those parliamentary election, we didn't have any clear majority. So the situation now is that the extreme left came together with the extreme right and just make the government fall. As simple as that.
So what happens now? Who's going to succeed Michel Barnier as Prime Minister?
Well, my deep wish would be that Michel Barnier succeed at himself. But I don't know. The president now is going to have a lot of consultation. I would like to remind you that last time it took almost 4 more than 3 weeks to have a prime minister. So I hope that he will appoint a new prime minister very, very soon so we can continue to vote the budget, because right now we don't have any parliamentary work because we don't have a government anymore.
But will Barnier stay on as caretaker prime minister until a new prime minister is found? And can he stay on as... But can he stay on as caretaker prime minister until, for example, next July, when there are fresh parliamentary elections?
No. That is not possible. That is just for a short period of time, the time that the president will appoint somebody else or himself again. You know, it's very possible. I mean, technically, the president can appoint him again to form a new government. That is very possible. Technically, it's open, but I don't think it will be the case, unfortunately.
Okay, and in terms of candidates, who's on the short list, do you think?
Well, we have a lot. You know, you always have candidates for the job, and then when they are appointed, they don't make it anymore. You know, it's very common everywhere on earth. So we have Mr. Lecornu, who was Minister of Defense. We have François Bayrou, who is an old friend of the president and old character of the French political landscape. We have Bruno Retailleau, who was previously Minister of Interior. He's he's an excellent minister with a lot of will to do the best for the country. So we have a lot of candidates. We always have a lot of candidates, you know, that happens, as I told you, everywhere.
I mean, isn't the next prime minister just going to face exactly the same problems that Barnier faced, in particular this issue of the budget?
Well, the issue of the budget is not really the issue. The issue is that you have a technician of the chaos in this Assemblée Nationale. You have people who just want to create a chaos. So whatever will be the subject, you know, when you want to kill your dog, you just say that he's in rage. So I think that whatever will be the subject, they will always find an alibi to create this kind of chaos. The budget is not an alibi. And then they blackmail the prime minister, and the prime minister cannot be blackmailed in a democracy.
But this budget is extremely unpopular with the French public. Why is that? Don't they realise that it's not for fun that President Macron would put a budget like that on his radar? He sees it as a necessity for France in the longer term. Don't the people understand that?
No, I'm in a finance committee, and the budget is not so bad. The problem is that we have a huge deficit, and we have to reduce it. So we have to cut measure. But this budget was not so bad. It's just that the communication around it and what the extreme left or extreme right did about this budget gave this bad impression. But the budget is not so bad regarding the huge debt that France have. So, I mean, when you own money, you know, when the budget of the interest of the debt is almost equivalent to the budget of the defense, it's more than 50 billion euro a year. So maybe you have to pay attention. And then we have European Union who ask her precisely to pay attention to this huge deficit. So the budget is not so bad. As I told you, for me, it's just an alibi.
Yeah, Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far-right National Rally, said that the budget was toxic for the French people.
It is toxic for the French people. She is more toxic than any budget.
She also said that all of this was a problem of Emmanuel Macron's making. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that the president didn't use the right proceedings, that he did very bad to recall a parliamentary election last year. Last summer, it was a big, huge mistake. But then Mrs. Le Pen is not saying anything about the effort that all of French taxpayers did during COVID to support the company, to support the people, to solve this pandemic, and the effort that they did for the people to pay last taxes, and all the effort that has been done last year and the year before. She just sees the dark side of the history.
France hasn't found itself.
But the extreme left is the same.
Okay, and I was just going to say France hasn't found itself in a situation like this where a prime minister has been toppled by a no-confidence vote since 1962 when Pompidou's government lost a confidence vote. There are more than 2 years left of President Macron's term. Do you think he can survive this?
I think that we need a good fortune teller. But I think the situation will be very, very difficult because, you know, the people who are used to blackmail, if they blackmail once, they will blackmail again, whoever will be prime minister. And then, as I told you, you have some extreme left technician of chaos, and whoever will be prime minister, they will jump on it and on him and try to jeopardize the situation. So I don't know what kind of magic rabbit will come out of the presidential hat as a prime minister, but we wish him a very good luck.
But going back to this concept of the president surviving this political storm, according to two opinion polls, one I saw said 54% of the French public want Emmanuel Macron to resign right now. Another poll said 64% of the French public want Emmanuel Macron to resign right now. I mean, can we really not rule out early presidential elections?
You know, polls are not making a politic. But what I think is that the people are scared. They are scared of what they hear. They are scared of strikes. They are scared of the instability. And then they blame the president for it. And so if the president is not able to deal with that, they want the president to change. So the results that you just mentioned are very logical regarding the situation.
And given, as you said, this gamble of the elections in July backfired on President Macron, I mean, it's very difficult for the French public to blame anyone but him, isn't it?
You know, everybody is blaming him, even his very close team, because the closer people were not aware about this situation that he will recall election after the European election. It's a drastic and dramatic mistake. Nobody can say something else, but now we have to deal with the situation. And France is a big country. We are a permanent member of the Security Council. We have international issue. We have a financial issue. We have social issue, and we need a government to deal with. So we need to be responsible. We need to have a solution which will fit till the next presidential election. That is our task now for member of the parliament.
But this is really worrying for the whole of Europe, isn't it? Because France and Germany are supposed to be the two strong leaders in Europe. And we've got a situation where both of them are looking politically extremely fragile, aren't they?
Sure, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because we miss a strong leadership. We don't have a strong leadership in Europe. We don't have this couple, France and Germany together as we used to have in the past. Then we had the Brexit, and then we have the rest of the world turning, and they are not waiting for us to move ahead. So it's a very, very, very difficult situation and very fragile. I do agree.
Senator, I know you have to go.
And I'm very sorry for that.
In a couple of words, what do you think this means for France's standing on the international stage?
Well, I hope that we will have a solution very soon because we have to keep our place in the international community. But I think that that makes us very weak and not trustable at all. So I think that we will have to solve this fact, and the people have to put a general interest on the table instead of their own interest. That is my wish for today.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much. French Senator Nathalie Goulet, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
This agreement should also open the path for a ceasefire too long awaited with regards to the incomparable suffering of the population in Gaza. The restoration of Lebanon's sovereignty requires the immediate election of a president of the republic, capable of uniting the Lebanese through the formation of a strong and representative government, and the adoption of the reforms necessary for the country's economic and financial recovery.
The French president speaking there. Well, for more, we can speak now to David Hale, former US ambassador to Lebanon and former US special envoy for peace in the Middle East under President Barack Obama. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to ask you about these US-mediated talks. Something of an achievement, some are saying, for the outgoing Biden administration. To whom do you give credit for the outcome of these talks?
Well, obviously, the administration worked very hard, led by Amos Hochstein, who is the envoy charged with trying to come up with this agreement. But I think really, to answer your question, it's the achievement of Israel to have done so much to basically diminish Hezbollah's power and bring it to a point where Hezbollah was desperate, I think, for an end to the fighting. We heard we heard Netanyahu say the other day that this is a pause, and frankly, they want to refocus their energies on the main goal, which is Iran. And that, of course, is going to be the big issue for the new incoming Trump administration.
But some people are saying in Lebanon and in Iran, this is a triumph for Hezbollah, that this is an admission of defeat by Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, are there really any winners and losers here?
Well, time will tell. Obviously, Hezbollah is going to put the best face on this that it can, and the TV images clearly show a sense of celebration among its people. And there is a countervailing view among the anti-Hezbollah Lebanese, at least those I'm in touch with, who feel very despondent. That just at a moment when there was the possibility of basically eliminating Hezbollah's military as well as political influence in Lebanon, that opportunity has now been snatched away because of this ceasefire. I would focus less on the arrangements that are going to be made in South Lebanon, which are unlikely to be adequate. They never have been before in the last 40 years of this conflict. But what are we all going to do about Iran? And if the power equation in the Middle East shifts back against Iran, then the elements in Lebanon that want a free, independent country will be reinforced.
But Iran doesn't sound like it's got any intention of shifting its focus away from Lebanon. We've just heard from Tehran. It will show firm support for the Lebanese government, the nation, and for resistance. I mean, that doesn't sound particularly conciliatory, does it?
No, and again, I would expect this to be the case. I think the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards of Iran, are basically running Hezbollah now on a day-to-day basis and continues their support. And as far as I can tell, we don't have a lot of the details of the ceasefire agreement, but nothing's going to stop Iran from continuing to supply weapons and money and rhetorical support to Hezbollah, which, unless we intervene over time, will be able to regain its strength.
Some in Israel do not support this deal that's been put in place with Lebanon. We've heard from Itamar Ben-Gvir saying we're missing a historic opportunity to strike Hezbollah hard, bring them to their knees. I'm just wondering how widely shared you think that opinion is in Washington.
Oh, I don't think it's widely shared here. Obviously, we don't have in Washington the level of attention on the details in Lebanon in the way that the Israeli public and leadership does. I think, frankly, Israel had done about as much as it could have done militarily to counter Hezbollah. This was going to come to an end at some point. Again, I don't want to keep repeating myself, but the real question is, what are we going to do now to continue to press the advantages against Iran that the Israeli operations have created? How can we rebalance the power equation in the Middle East? That's the key question for the Trump administration.
Indeed. Just going back to the deal itself, it's a 60-day truce. What's your understanding of what happens when the 60 days are up?
Well, I guess it's no coincidence, but in 60 days is also when we're going to have a new administration coming into office. During this period, the expectation, I believe, is the Israelis will gradually withdraw from South Lebanon. Hezbollah is likely to continue to claim that Israel remains an occupation of a slender slice of Lebanese territory, which internationally is not recognized, but which Hezbollah uses as a pretext to maintain its so-called resistance. I also think that, frankly, UNIFIL doesn't have the authority by the Security Council to use force against Hezbollah, and nor will this monitoring group that has been discussed be on the ground. So there's really nothing that's going to stop the Hezbollah from putting people back in close proximity of Israel, except the Lebanese army. And the problem with the Lebanese army is not its military capacity, but the political will. It reflects the sectarian makeup of the country and would be loath to put itself in a confrontational position with Hezbollah because of the risk of breaking the army apart. So there's there are a lot of gaps in this agreement that I think Hezbollah will be exploiting, just as they did in 2006 when the last war ended.
But the United States and France have said they're going to help the Lebanese army. What do you understand as being their role? How are they going to support this army and make sure that it actually does a role that doesn't actually then leave a void that gets filled by Hezbollah?
Well, any support for the army is welcome. And we've been, along primarily with the British, doing a great deal to train and equip the Lebanese army. But the flaw in the thinking, I think, is to believe that it's a question of military capacity. It's not. It is a problem of political will. And so we've been supporting the Lebanese army so that there's an alternative, a state-run, state-led, accountable army as an alternative to this foreign-backed militia, Hezbollah, not to confront Hezbollah. That will only come about through a political process. And then we can hopefully point to the Lebanese army as a legitimate alternative to Hezbollah. We're not there yet. There's been nothing that I've seen to suggest that there's any change in the political equation in Lebanon. So it would be premature to believe, frankly, that the Lebanese army's military capacity will make the difference.
It's interesting that Hezbollah had said that they wouldn't cease hostilities until the fighting stopped in Gaza. The fighting continues in Gaza, and yet Hezbollah has agreed to this cessation of hostilities. I'm just wondering why you think they've changed their tune. I mean, is that a sign of weakness and serious degradation, as perhaps Israel might argue?
Yes, and it's an absolute sign of desperation. And there's nothing Hezbollah and Iran wanted more than this ceasefire. So you can draw whatever lessons you want from that or conclusions from that. But they're down, but they're not out. And this ceasefire does give them the opportunity to regain at least some of the strength that they've lost over the last year.
And just looking more broadly at the region, I mean, do you think perhaps credit can be given as well to the Biden administration for the fact that this war did not actually spread further than many had feared it might? It didn't become the regional war that some had feared it might become. Do you think credit is due there for the ability of the Secretary of State to contain it to some extent?
Well, I'm not sure I would agree that it was relatively contained. Obviously, I suppose it could have been worse, but we've had Iranian-directed violence directed at Israel and the United States and its allies and our shipping interests from the Red Sea to Gaza to Lebanon to Iraq. And Iran continues to dominate, frankly, the situation in Baghdad, Beirut, Damascus, and Sana'a. So we are in a regional contest here. It could have gotten hotter and it could still get hotter. But frankly, as a great power, if we're not prepared to stand up to the Iranians, they're going to continue to call the shots in the Middle East. And there'll be another October 7 before you know it, unless we come up with a game plan that's actually going to really, really press the advantages that Israel has gained against Iran.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. David Hale, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, for more analysis, I'm joined now by Mick Mulvaney, the former Chief of Staff to the US President-elect Donald Trump. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Mr. Mulvaney. I just want to ask you, first of all, to whom do we give the most credit, do you think? Who deserves the credit for bringing this deal about, which has resulted in a ceasefire in Lebanon?
Well, Tom, thanks for having me. I think you sort of anticipate the answer by your question, which is everyone will always seek to take credit. There's no question about that. My guess is Donald Trump, sitting in Mar-a-Lago here this week, will be making the case, and in fact is making the case that one of the reasons this deal got cut is that Hezbollah was afraid of what he might do when he comes into office in January. At the same time, I'm sure the Biden administration will take credit for doing the hard work necessary to get it done. I think at the end of the day, very few people here really care that much about who takes the credit. We're just glad that the deal was arranged.
Okay, so you would say it's fair to say, therefore, something of a parting victory for the outgoing Biden administration, nevertheless?
Look, I remember back in 1979 when after Ronald Reagan got elected, shortly thereafter, the Iranians released the American hostages. Reagan took credit. Carter took credit. There's no, success has many mothers and failure is an orphan. So I don't think that many people here outside of the immediate Trump circle and the immediate Biden circle are worried that much about who gets the credit.
Okay, this is, of course, a 60-day truce, and we all know that in 60 days from now there'll be a new administration in the White House. And I just wonder what you think the return of Donald Trump. And I know you've already touched on it briefly, but what do you think his return will mean specifically for this deal?
Well, for this deal and for the broader deal, Trump is going to be a lot more aggressive, I think, than Biden is. Certainly his language will be more aggressive. We know that from his first term in office. But he is not afraid to play at a little bit higher stakes. And I think he's arguably a little bit more aligned with Israel than Joe Biden was. In fact, I think certainly you could make that case. So how the immediate swearing in of Donald Trump takes place in January, which takes place in January, will affect the outcome. It sort of remains to be seen. But generally speaking, I think that Donald Trump is going to be tougher on Iran than Joe Biden was.
Yeah, there is a lot of speculation that now the Lebanon problem is resolved, at least for the next 60 days. Perhaps attention will shift to Gaza and, as you say, as well to Iran. And I just wonder what specifically on Iran Mr. Trump might have in store.
Well, look, face it, we look at least the Republicans in this country, not the least of which Donald Trump, look at Hezbollah and Hamas through the lens of Iran. Without Iran's influence, Hamas and Hezbollah would not be nearly the difficulties that they are. So I think you can expect a much tougher position on the Iranian nuclear program. That's been proven to be the case already. We had a very soft, sort of dovish attitude towards Iran under the Obama administration. It was much more hawkish under Donald Trump in his first administration, a little bit more to the other extreme with Joe Biden. Now the pendulum will be swinging back again with Donald Trump. So if you ask the general question, what will Donald Trump be like on Iran, on Hezbollah, on Hamas in his second term, the answer is pretty much the same as the first.
Okay, and with regards to Gaza, how hopeful are you that now, as I said, Lebanon is resolved, perhaps normal life can start being rebuilt for the Lebanese people? What do you see happening for the people of Gaza?
Well, certainly resolving the issue in Lebanon will make Gaza simpler. I don't want to use easier because it's still a very difficult situation, and it's going to continue to be. But at least now there's only one sort of variable in the conversation. If you can put the Lebanese Hezbollah issue to bed for at least 60 days, and I'm hoping that it lasts longer than that, then you can focus all of our attention here in the U.S. And in your part of the world towards Gaza. Whether or not Hamas is willing to make the sacrifices necessary or make the agreements necessary in order to get peace remains to be seen. But now they'll be back out on their own again, which I think puts the Israelis in a much better position.
Now, you'd know the answer to this question, and I'm curious to know what you think. But don't foreign policy issues invariably look much easier to an administration in opposition than they do to the actual administration that's in office? Because, of course, the administration in office has access to material, to intelligence reports that people outside the administration don't have. Do you think that is the case? And do you think perhaps the reality of the situation is quite different from how it may appear to a party in opposition, i.e. on the campaign trail for Donald Trump and his party?
Sure. I think that's the case for not just global issues, matters of foreign policy, but for most issues. Inflation looks a lot more simple to you when you are in opposition than you are the ruling party, and that's not probably unique to the United States of America. But certainly the issue in Gaza is going to continue to be complicated. Might it be simplified a little bit for purposes of campaigns? Absolutely. There's no question about that. I don't think the average voting American has the time or the interest to get down into every little detail about what's happening in Gaza. So campaigning necessarily probably simplifies that a little bit. But to your point, yes, when you are in office, things are probably a little bit more complicated, and you are playing for keeps. You're playing with real stakes, as we say in the United States. When you're in opposition on the outside looking in, you can be as critical as you want to without much sort of real world implications. But when you're the party in charge, you're playing with real money.
I'd just like to ask you, Mr. Mulvaney, about the new US ambassador to Israel, Mick Huckabee. And I'd just like to ask you what you think he and his appointment will bring to the region.
Yeah, I've talked to Mr. Governor Huckabee. He was the former governor of the state of Arkansas, ran for president. I know him relatively well. I'm close with his daughter. She and I work together in the White House. And I've talked to him briefly since his designation as the future U.S. ambassador. I think he brings some clarity of purpose, some clarity of policy, but most importantly, and this applies, I think, around the world, he has a direct line of communication into the White House. I was a special envoy in Northern Ireland after my term in the White House, and one of the things that I thought was the most valuable to me as an envoy of my government, as a member of the diplomatic corps, was to be able to pick up the phone and call the President of the United States directly. And Mike Huckabee will have that. That type of thing makes decision-making quicker, perhaps more effective, and also allows the communication to be clearer and crisper with less with less chance of miscommunication and so forth. So I think it's an excellent pick. I've talked to to various communities here in this group, in this country, including some of the Arab American groups and the Israeli American groups, and generally they seem pleased with the decision. Mr. Huckabee has a great deal of credibility, especially within the White House, and I think he'll make an excellent ambassador.
And I'd like to just ask you lastly about the other nominees in the incoming Trump administration, particularly those with a foreign policy portfolio, and what you think they mean for specifically the Middle East.
It's a fascinating sort of process. And we saw this a little bit in the first iteration of the Trump administration, in that Trump likes to surround himself with people who disagree with him and disagree with each other. And disagreement is not to be confused with disloyalty. He's hiring very loyal people. Every president does. But there are people who coming into the White House who see the world generally differently than he does. Marco Rubio, the incoming Secretary of State, would be considered to be more of a neoconservative sort of personality. The same could be said of an incoming national security advisor. This was true, by the way, in the first administration when President Trump brought in John Bolton, who didn't agree with the president on a lot of different things, but the president valued his input into the communication. So what you're going to see again in the second version of Trump is a variety of perspectives inside the White House. There will be people who will be more neoconservative when it comes to foreign policy, those who will be more non-interventionist. There will be folks who are fiercely pro-Israel and folks who are more neutral on issues that happen in the Gulf and so forth. So you'll see a variety of issues, a variety of perspectives brought to the table. And I think that's reflective of the people he's naming so far to the cabinet.
Okay, well, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time today. Mick Mulvaney, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Tom.
Well, I'm joined now by Kurt Volker, who is the former US ambassador to NATO, and also the former US special representative for Ukraine negotiations under President Donald Trump. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You were in that position during the years 2017 to 2019 as the special negotiator. I just want to ask you, first of all, about these embassy threats. What's your understanding of what's going on here?
Well, because of the Biden administration's decision to lift the restrictions on the use of ATACMS so that they can be used at longer range, which is a restriction that should have never been invented to begin with, they're now concerned that there might be Russian counterattacks or Russian escalation. There are, of course, Russian attacks on Kyiv and other major Ukrainian cities every single night. So this is nothing particularly new. But I guess they had some intelligence that a big one would come after this, so they decided as a matter of caution just to close the embassy. I do have to say, however, I think it would be very unwise and very unlikely that Russia would deliberately attack a U.S. embassy.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about these ATACMS, because as you say, and as you've said in other interviews, Ukraine should have been given them long ago. You've suggested that these weapons might somehow bring President Putin to the negotiating table. Correct me if I'm wrong, but what did you mean by that?
Yeah, that's not quite the way I put it. What they will do is force Russia to react. Russia's still going to attack Ukraine. No one should have any illusions about that. They've been attacking Ukraine for nearly 3 years in a row now, so they're not going to change. But it will allow Ukraine to hit back at a greater distance with precision against where the Russians are attacking from, against fuel, ammunition, supply depots. So it's going to complicate Russia's effort. And I think we're going into a phase right now where Putin is realizing that his own military is in a relatively weak position. He doesn't have the personnel to refill the ranks. He's getting them from North Korea. He doesn't have the artillery shells. He's getting those from North Korea. He doesn't have the drones. He's getting those from Iran. But I think he knows his window is limited here. So he's going to try to grab as much as he can now during this presidential transition, on the expectation that there will have to be some kind of settlement or at least stabilization of the conflict next year once Trump is in office.
We'll come on to that in just a moment, looking ahead towards the Trump administration. But in terms of how Russia responds, are you not concerned at this stage that this, which is described as a massive escalation, i.e. the supply of these attackers to Ukraine, might trigger some sort of major response?
Yeah, it makes me laugh to hear the Russians call this a massive escalation. Russia has been attacking Ukraine with long-range missiles, with drones, with ballistic missiles, everything you can imagine for nearly 3 years now. They've been abducting children. They've been deliberately targeting civilians and civilian areas. They've been trying to knock out the heat and the electricity so that people suffer through the winter. That is all just incredibly outrageous behavior. And then here we take a self-imposed limit of only firing a certain number of kilometers into Russian, or not even into Russian territory, because that was a gesture toward Russia, and we removed that, and now they're somehow, grievously offended. It is funny how the Russians are able to twist this that way.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to what you're saying and, quite dramatic language, as you say, Moscow has been using with regards to the provision of these weapons to Ukraine. I mean, there does seem to be, doesn't there? Of course, with these veiled threats and the possibility of attacks on embassies in Kyiv, it seems there's a strong sort of psychological dimension to Russia's war effort.
That's exactly right. You put your finger on it. They are trying to get inside our heads to deter us from taking actions that we're capable of. And one of the reasons for that is because it has worked in the past, so they want to keep doing it. Another reason is that they are not capable of escalating. They don't have the troops. They don't have the ammunition. It's not as if Russia is attacking Ukraine half-heartedly right now and holding back its main effort. Quite the contrary. They are losing up to 1,500 people a day on the front line, striving as hard as they can to take just inches of territory. They don't have the capability to escalate, but they want us to think they do so that we back down.
As well as thinking that perhaps the delivery of the ATACMS was rather late in the day, I've also heard you quoted as saying, why not just give this weaponry, or words to this effect, why not just hand over this weaponry quietly, perhaps with a little bit less fanfare, less of an announcement? And I'm just wondering, what is the point of announcing that you're handing over weapons to Ukraine? Why does Washington do that, as opposed to just, as you say?
It's a great question. From a military or a political strategic standpoint, it makes no sense to announce these things. First off, we shouldn't have had the restriction to begin with. Secondly, if we're going to remove it, just remove it. You don't have to talk about it, just do it. And I guess they want to get credit domestically for doing it. I guess there may be some who think that this is fair to Russia, that as if there is a reason to be fair to Russia here because of what they're doing. But maybe they feel it's better to do that. Or maybe it's just the lack of discipline in the administration that this leaks out as people start talking, even though it wasn't made in a formal White House announcement.
Okay, and so basically, other than irritating Washington and provoking quite dramatic-sounding statements, it doesn't achieve anything.
Well, I think the Russian fiery rhetoric and expressions of grievous harm don't achieve anything. I think the use of these weapons at a longer range will have some impact in forcing Russia to adjust. And since they are still attacking Ukraine every day, anything that can be done to complicate their logistics, complicate their command and control, take out some ammunition depots, all those things are incrementally heading in the right direction.
Okay, so if all of this is about making the West frightened, comments like what we heard from the Russian Foreign Intelligence Chief, Sergei Naryshkin, who says that Moscow will retaliate against NATO countries that facilitate long-range Ukrainian missile strikes against Russian territory, plus President Vladimir Putin revisiting the country's nuclear doctrine. You're saying we've got nothing particular to worry about here?
Right. I think this is the third time so far in the course of this Russian aggression against Ukraine that Russia has tweaked its nuclear doctrine somehow because they want to create fear in the West. The reality is that nuclear weapons use would not be in Russia's interest. Any strategic use would immediately get a strategic response and would be the end of Russia. Any tactical use would not achieve any military objectives and draw a conventional response against Russian forces doing it that the Russian military itself cannot tolerate. So I just don't see them escalating into nuclear weapons unless they feel that the Russian state itself is under threat. And then their nuclear doctrine would kick in, and I could see them using nuclear weapons. But the fact is that nobody is doing that. No one is threatening the Russian state. No one is trying to march toward Moscow. No one is bombing civilians in Moscow. So these are just threats aimed at influencing Western decision-making.
China sounds a bit worried. We've got a statement from China in response to the lowering of the threshold for a nuclear strike. China saying there must be restraints on all sides, calling for people to remain calm. I mean, do you see China playing potentially a useful role here at all?
Well, useful is a bit of an overstatement. I think that China does not, they certainly don't want to see nuclear weapons use. They also are not terribly comfortable with Russia's reckless waging of this war. It has united the West. It has exposed Russia as weak. And it is now, China is now being linked to Russia in ways that undercut China's own objectives of being seen as a legitimate power broker in East Asia. So I think the Chinese would be very happy if this war just went away.
Let's go back to what we were talking about a little earlier on. You mentioned the advent of the Trump administration in just under, well, exactly 2 months from now. And speaking in Prague in August, again, correct me if I'm wrong in paraphrasing you, but you said words to the effect that Donald Trump is serious about ending this war. And I just wonder how you think he's going to do this and how he's going to negotiate a deal and at what cost.
Yeah. So the key thing here, and what President Trump frequently refers to, is President Reagan's comment of peace through strength. He constantly points to President Biden as having been weak, and Putin and Iran and others having taken advantage of the United States because of America's weakness under Biden. The implication there is that he wants to show strength and change their behavior by being strong. I think what he will do in the case of Russia's attacks on Ukraine is call Putin, as he said he would, and tell Putin to end the war. Now, Putin will have demands, and I think Trump just needs to stay firm and say, you need to end the war, or else we are going to continue to give Ukraine all the weaponry and all the support that it needs on a lend-lease basis so they can borrow it and pay us back later. But you're going to find that this is not going to work out well for Russia. You need to end the war now. I think that Putin, for his own reasons, as we mentioned, their military is in a much weaker position than they want to admit. Their economy is in a much weaker position than they want to admit. And they're not going to be able to keep this up for years on end. So I think that Putin may actually be getting ready for that kind of conversation as well and agreeing to take a pause in the war. Now, I don't believe that he would give up on his objectives. It would just be a matter of taking a break in the fighting for a while. But we would need to use that break to then stabilize the conflict, strengthen Ukraine, provide permanent security guarantees and economic integration of Ukraine into the West.
But you've also said in the past, sorry to keep quoting you back to yourself, you said that Putin is wily, he's cunning, and he wants all of Ukraine. I mean, therefore, doesn't Donald Trump have mission impossible in trying to negotiate some sort of a settlement with him?
No, just what I just now said is that Putin will, he may look for a pause in the war, and then he would use that to try to regroup with the intent of taking Ukraine again, some point in the future, attacking again. We need to understand that. We need to know that's what he's going to do, and take our own steps to prevent that to prevent him from being able to do that. That's what I'm saying there. We do need an end to the fighting, but then we also need to pivot that to a permanent peace, and that's going to be through strengthening Ukraine, strong security guarantees, ideally NATO membership, and integrating them into the Western economies.
How would you describe the nature of the relationship between those two men, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin?
Well, in an odd sort of way, what you would say is they respect each other, because they are both people who understand power and how to use power, and they see that in the other. So it's not a matter of disrespect or knowing that the other's weak or taking advantage of them. I think they understand that their counterpart there, the other guy, actually understands the use of power too. That in some ways may make for a better negotiation.
And having been in the position you've been in as a negotiator for Ukraine in 2017 to 2019, I'm just wondering what your experience is of negotiating with Russians. Have you had to do that? What sort of mindset there is on the Russian side? You know, what sort of insights can you offer us into what it's actually like to sit down and do negotiations with the Putin administration?
Well, the first thing is that there's only one decision maker in Russia, and that's Vladimir Putin. So whoever you're talking to doesn't have any leeway on their own. They're just there to be someone to talk to. But the idea is that you have to influence Putin's decision making. Back then, 2017 to 2019, there was no hot raging war of the kind that we have now. There was a hot war, but it was only a few people a week who were getting killed, nothing as big as it is now, and the front line was not moving. So this was not a major priority for President Trump at the time. A lot has changed since then. But at the time, then my Russian interlocutors would fill the time by talking, but not really be able to make any decisions. I used talks basically to try to explore if there's anything possible. I felt that a couple times there were things worth exploring, but in the end, Putin decided that he wanted to keep things as they were.
I mean, do you think that you and your colleagues and even Donald Trump saw any of this coming? Donald Trump obviously left office in 2020, beginning of 21. Do you think he saw things coming to the point that we've reached now?
Well, you know, you can never predict with certainty what's going to happen in the future, but the idea that Russia would continue to have designs on Ukrainian territory and the possibility of future attacks, absolutely. That's why in 2017, it was President Trump who agreed to lift the arms embargo on Ukraine. You'll remember that President Obama and Chancellor Merkel agreed on not providing Ukraine any lethal defensive arms. Trump reversed that and gave them their first anti-tank systems, and that opened up the gateway for others to provide lethal systems, knowing that Ukraine is going to have to be capable of defending itself someday.
And just lastly, I mean, a lot of rhetoric about the Third World War. It hasn't just come from Moscow, I would add. Donald Trump Jr. Suggested, and some people in the inner sanctum of Donald Trump have said that President Biden is somehow leading the United States and the West into the Third World War. Just to end, really, I mean, how would you assess that threat level? Do you think it's really a reality that we're edging closer to a situation where there is an all-out Third World War?
I think a situation where the U.S. and the West are seen as weak, and where aggressive players like Putin or Iran or China feel that they can act with impunity, that increases the risks of global conflict. And that's exactly what we've seen over the last 3 years. We've seen Russia invade Ukraine. We've seen Iran unleash its proxies in the growth of this war in the Middle East. We've seen increasingly aggressive Chinese behavior against the Philippines, against Vietnam, threats against Taiwan. And that's all because they perceive Western weakness. So restoring a position of strength and trying to maintain peace through a position of strength is the way to prevent a Third World War. And if we don't do that, the risks increase.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Kurt Volker, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Tom.
Well, for more analysis, we can cross now to London and speak to General David Richards, former UK Chief of the Defence Staff. Lord Richards, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. We're getting these reports that suggest that Ukraine has now fired UK-supplied long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles at Russia for the very first time. Moscow saying it's shot some of these missiles down. Does all of this sound credible to you? And if so, how significant is this?
I think it's certainly credible. Our Prime Minister seemed to be keen to do this a number of weeks ago, but had to wait for President Biden to give authority to use American ATACMS, because there's a linkage to the guidance systems that the British use for their Storm Shadow. So I think it's the case. I mean, we'll, as ever, and I learned this as a soldier of many years, you never believe first reports, but I think it probably is credible and has now happened. The significance, we would say that it might have tactical significance. That's, if you like, local importance. But in terms of the eventual outcome of the war, i.e. the strategic level, I doubt it'll have much value.
So you don't see this as being the major escalation that some in Moscow are calling it?
I can see why the Russians would view it as an escalation, because it does bring Western weapons, allows Western weapons to be fired into and onto Russian territory. So that is an escalation of kinds, but and it will annoy them. There's no doubt about it. They thought they weren't going to have that extra headache because they've already moved a lot of their logistic bases and air bases further east to get out of this possible quandary. But why I say I don't think it's of huge significance is that at the end of the day, it's not going to cause Russia to lose the war. It might put Ukraine into a better bargaining position for when, as even now President Zelensky seems to concede, President-elect Trump comes to power and decides to impose in some way a ceasefire.
Do you think Washington and London were right to give these weapons to Ukraine and the green light to now use them on Russian territory?
Well, I think one could argue that it's too little and too late. And it sounds now, it can appear to some people, it's a little bit sort of a panicky reaction on the back of President Trump winning the election. If this had happened 2 years ago, then I think it could have had much greater significance. The problem that Ukraine has faced from the start is that Western nations, particularly the US, Britain, France, have encouraged President Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight a war without giving them the means to actually win it. I think that is strategically questionable, but also morally questionable, because people are dying on a daily basis in the hope of achieving a victory that in practice will be very difficult to achieve. So I think I'm with President Trump insofar as now is the time to draw a line under this one way or another. Clearly, Ukraine wants to be in as good a position as she can be at the point that line is drawn. But to go on fighting, and some people talk about a frozen war, means there'll be a very unstable and increasingly unstable situation in Eastern Europe. Mistakes will happen. People do silly things. And suddenly, the thing has got a lot worse. So I think now is the time, unless NATO nations are prepared to enter the war themselves, and I don't think that's going to happen for good reason, then now is the time to start talking about a ceasefire.
Earlier this week, we spoke to a spokesperson for Vladimir Putin, Sergei Markov, who said that people in the UK could be spending Christmas in a bomb shelter. He seemed to suggest that a NATO-Russian confrontation was quite likely by making that comment.
Well, I think, first of all, the only person that really matters is President Putin. Why would he do that when Mr. Trump is about to take over the reins of power? He will not want added problems in terms of resolving this problem. the war in Ukraine. So I doubt personally that is likely to happen. And anyway, that would be, and what he implies in it, a major escalation, which would draw NATO into the war directly, as opposed to the indirect manner in which he is interpreting the use of these Western weapons.
Yeah, the comments were made in the context of the loosening of the nuclear doctrine. I just want to pick up on something you said earlier on this year. You were amongst a group of former defence and security chiefs in the UK who said the British Army must, quote, prepare genuinely for war. You made those comments 8 months ago, and I'm just wondering whether you think that since then the UK is looking more prepared and whether you think the threat is looking greater.
Well, look, I'm the biggest peacenik of all time, like a lot of, I think, reasonably good generals, because we've seen a bit of war. The whole point of preparing for war is not to fight it, God forbid, but to be strong enough to make one's potential adversary not want to take us on. And I think what we've got to remember in the case of Russia and Ukraine is that strategically, Russia has lost. NATO today is stronger, more united than NATO was 3 years ago. They have got hold of the 4 oblasts, or the bulk of the 4 oblasts in the east of Ukraine, and they've retained Crimea. But I don't think one could argue that strategically they've won. But we don't want to take a risk. And therefore, NATO nations now have a period in which they have got to make sure that should Russia up the ante again in some way, I've always personally felt it unlikely, but we shouldn't take the risk by making sure our own armed forces are more than up to any challenge that could be offered by Russia. But look, I'm like a lot of good guys. I said I want to avoid a war. I'm not encouraging one. I think it's time to draw a line under this broadly in the way that I understand President Trump is intending. And that seems to me a very sensible thing to do.
All right, well, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Lord Richards. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Well, let's get some more analysis now. We can speak to the former spokesperson for the Russian President Vladimir Putin, Sergei Markov, who joins us now from Moscow. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Mr. Markov. Washington, of course, gave Ukraine the green light to use those long-range army tactical missile systems weapons, also known as ATACMS, against targets in Russia. And we understand they have now been used in Bryansk. I'm just wondering what more you can tell us about the situation.
I think you explained situation by wrong way. You just repeated those propagandistic lie which expressed by Washington. Situation absolutely another. And Vladimir Putin, President of Russia, stresses very clearly. The point is that it's not allowing for Washington to Ukrainian army to use these rocket missiles. But it's direct using of such rocket missiles against Russia by American army, because Ukrainian army not able to use ATACMS, these ballistic missiles on the long distance to Russia, because Ukrainian army has no technical opportunity such as satellite intelligence group, which needed for using such missiles. Another kind of missiles is Storm Shadow and Scalp, French Scalp and British Storm Shadow. This is cruise missiles. They also cannot be used by Ukrainian army without America, because it's need, first of all, same satellite group, but also it's needed a very good digital map of Russian territory for such cruise missile. It's even Great Britain and France has not such kind of map, but only Russia and United States. So if these missiles will be used against Russia, it means that American army directly took to the war against Russia. It's not Ukrainian. It's American strike against Russian cities and in other places. It's the point. It's this rocket missile didn't change situation dramatically on the front line, because these missiles have been used already against Crimea, against Donbass, and another new territory of Russia, internationally not recognized.
So if they have been used, Mr. Markov, if they have been used, how's Russia going to respond? How's Russia going to respond if they have been used?
Nobody knows.
Well, Russia must know.
Decide. Russia will wait some moment. Probably Russia will give a strong military response. It means Russia now has the right to attack all American military goals. American military base in Poland, in Germany, in Romania, and another European countries. Also, Russia can attack the American satellites group, which used for such kind of attack, American aviation, military aviation, and so on. Okay. And its military response. Probably first Russia will try to give some political response, sneaking account that this is crime of Joe Biden group. Joe Biden is some kind of regarded in Moscow as a maniac who personally hate Vladimir Putin, because in 2011, Biden strongly recommended Putin not to go to the next presidential term, and Vladimir Putin strongly said no to him.
Let me put this question to you. Let me put this question to you, Mr. Markov. Is the West now in direct conflict with Russia?
Can you repeat? Sorry.
Is the West now in direct conflict with Russia?
Not yet, because we didn't see this big strike yet. There are some rumors that probably in Bryansk region had been used or not used. Now we see indirect, through media, information about that Biden made the decision to come to the direct war against Russia. But we didn't see the real fact about it. When Vladimir Putin sees the real fact, he will react. Frankly speaking, if it will be not strike against Washington and London, it's first of all because goodwill of Vladimir Putin.
Just want to pick up on something you said to the British media. You said that people in the UK could be spending Christmas in bomb shelters. Could you just clarify for us what you meant by that?
Yeah. It's very easy. Of course, Vladimir Putin don't want to give a strong military response and to come to the big global war. Of course, Vladimir Putin don't want to have nuclear war. But you understand, if United States and Great Britain started direct attacking of their militaries against Russia, Russia has to respond. And if it will be exchange of rocket missiles, first of all, non-nuclear, but then it could be moved, because it's nuclear powers, it could be moved to the nuclear, using of nuclear weaponry, and possibly already this year, big nuclear catastrophe could happen. And I mentioned that probably it will happen before Christmas holidays. And probably instead of saying Merry Christmas to all families, British and American people, and we will have to sit down in the holes in the ice, trying to hide away from the radioactive clouds.
Okay, well, that's something to think about. And, of course, Mr. Putin has lowered the threshold for a nuclear strike. And it's my last question to you. I mean, just listening to what you were saying and listening to the rhetoric from Moscow the last 24 hours, there are people in the West who say every time the West steps up its support for Ukraine, Russia threatens nuclear war. And, of course, we're 1,000 days into this conflict. So far, that hasn't happened. So what is your message to people who say that Russia is simply bluffing?
Russia don't want to use nuclear weaponry, but Russia wants to stress that if three nuclear powers like United States, Great Britain, and France come to the war against another nuclear power, Russia, this nuclear war could happen even by some natural development of the events. Look how World War I started. Nobody wanted such a big catastrophe as appeared to be this great war as World War I. But it happened because events move politicians. Events command politicians, but not politicians command events. It's a situation with Russia afraid very much. And Russia, and I am asking you, British people, don't attack Russia. Don't send your rocket missiles to Russian cities. As a way, you will have the response of Russian rocket missiles to your cities. Take this in your mind.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Well, Sergei Markov, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, turning our eye to the United States as the incoming Trump administration continues to take shape. Now, the television star, Dr. Mehmet Oz, who is better known simply as Dr. Oz, has been selected by the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump to serve as the administrator for the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services. That is a key federal agency that oversees health insurance coverage for more than 150 million Americans. Well, in a statement, Donald Trump said that America is facing a healthcare crisis, and he expressed confidence that no physician is more qualified or more capable than Dr. Oz to make America healthy again. Well, Donald Trump and Dr. Oz have a history of supporting each other politically. In 2018, Trump appointed the cardiothoracic surgeon and TV personality to the Presidential Council on Sports, Fitness and Nutrition, reappointing him in 2020. Then in 2022, Oz ran for Senate in Pennsylvania with Trump's backing, but failed in his election bid. After launching the Dr. Oz show in 2009, Oz became one of the best-known doctors in America, principally due to his appearances on the Oprah Winfrey Show. However, his views on COVID-19 raised some eyebrows, especially when he suggested using an anti-malarial drug as a treatment for the virus. Well, to talk more about this appointment and others, I'm joined now by Mary Jo Jacoby, who is the former Special Assistant to President Reagan and former Assistant Secretary of Commerce under George H.W. Bush. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start by talking about Dr. Oz. He's going to be leading the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. A budget of $1.7 trillion per year. Do you think he's the right man for the job?
I think that he is a physician. He is a well-known personality. He is committed to President Trump's agenda of cutting the budget and of improving America's health. And so I think in the mind of the president, which is the major mind that matters right now, he is qualified. He will have to go through Senate confirmation when he is formally nominated next year. That will be a challenging process. I've been through it. It's a challenging process for everyone, but the more well-known you are, it seems, the more challenging it will be. So he will not have an easy ride, but my guess is he will be confirmed.
As I said in the introduction, some of his opinions are not universally respected in the scientific community, and I'm just wondering whether there's anything about him that worries you in particular.
Well, I think from a Senate confirmation prospect in a Republican Senate, he has in the past expressed support for gender transitioning of young people, young men to young women to young men, which has become, it has always been controversial. It has become more controversial this year, given the presidential election. And I'm sure he will be questioned a great deal about that. And of course, as you mentioned, some of his comments and his support for some unusual drugs during the COVID period. But let's face it, a lot of doctors and others were getting pretty crazy about things that they thought might help us with COVID because we were in uncharted territory. So he will face a lot of questions. But he is a skilled communicator. And I think one of the things that's common, if you look at the breadth of President Trump's intended appointees so far, most of them have a lot of experience in communications, and in particular television.
Yeah, I mean, there's been critics of the incoming Trump administration, particularly on the other side of the aisle. One that stood out for me says the common theme amongst all the appointees is TV hosts whose main qualification is their loyalty to Donald Trump. Do you think that's fair criticism?
I do not think it's fair, but I do think it is fair game in politics. I've looked at the CVs of his appointees. All of them are highly educated. All of them are highly experienced. Most of them who have come to television came via other routes with business and political backgrounds or military backgrounds. So I think if you look past the headline to the individual, they are highly qualified people.
But looking at it from the outside, I mean, you know, we're talking about a celebrity television doctor here. I mean, you'd have thought, you know, especially he hasn't got any government experience, well, very limited government experience. I'm just wondering, aren't there any more qualified candidates out there?
I'm sure if you looked around for any job, whether you're a president of the United States or the chief executive of a very large company, there is a huge array of candidates available to you. But what the president has done is not unusual for presidents. If you look at President Biden's cabinet, for example, many of them had no experience or expertise in the area to which they were appointed, but they were the president's choice. They had other qualifications that President Biden saw, and these individuals have other qualifications that President Trump, when he becomes president, will see or has seen. And the other thing is, you do, in a political environment, you do want people who will help you execute your agenda. Now, if that means you're loyal to the person, that's fine. If that means you're loyal to the policies, that's even better.
Dr. Oz is going to report to RFK Jr., whose appointment we talked about extensively on this channel last week. He, of course, is going to be running the Department of Health. How do you see these two men, RFK Jr. and Dr. Oz, working together?
I think that they will probably work together very well. They both have huge areas to manage and huge areas of policy to help execute. And I think they will work together. They share a lot of the same positions with respect not only to President Trump's stated agenda, but things like a degree of skepticism about the COVID vaccine, which has become extremely widespread in the United States now. So I would expect that they will work together well, and they're both experienced people. RFK Jr. in the political arena. Dr. Oz had his own political experience running for the Senate. They understand politics. They understand the American political process. And I think what you'll see is when there are areas of disagreement, those areas will be discussed in private rather than in public, which is, frankly, what any leader wants.
Just before we move on to some of the other appointments, just wrapping up the healthcare department appointments, do you think the Affordable Care Act is somehow at risk of being axed with these two men in charge?
Certainly President Trump, President-elect Trump now, has said that he would like to axe it. I don't think he tried several times when he was president before, and it didn't seem possible. I think even with a Republican Senate and a Republican House, the appetite for that is not huge right now. But I would expect that you would see reform. So specifically with respect to Dr. Oz, President-elect Trump has talked about the whole question of Medicare for all, and how you would do that. And a lot of the Democrats have talked about that. It would be incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult to implement. And speaking as someone who is on Medicare, because in America, when you turn 65, regardless of your health insurance status, you have to go on Medicare, which is state-sponsored. I think it's probably not the best solution to apply Medicare to everyone, but I would expect to see a great deal of reform, not only in terms of Medicare and Medicaid, but in terms of the other activities of the Department of Health and Human Services with respect to things like the food pyramid, the recommended foods that are recommended for young people in particular. You can see a lot of reform coming in that regard. And they will be able to do a fair number of things administratively without an act of Congress.
Let's talk about one of the other big appointments of the last 24 hours. In education, Linda McMahon, the former CEO of World Wrestling Entertainment, is tapped for education secretary. I'm just wondering what you think she brings to the job.
She is a seasoned businesswoman. She was the administrator of the Small Business Administration in the first Trump administration. She has acquired a knowledge of how large government agencies with large budgets operate. She was co-head of the Trump transition team. She knows the president quite well. The president's quite well acquainted with her husband, Vince McMahon. And of course, WWE comes to the region quite often. She is a very good businesswoman, a very savvy businesswoman, and she supports the president's agenda. Whether they will be able to abolish the Department of Education, which is something President Trump has said, President-elect Trump has said he would like to do, I think that's a very big ask. But going back to my time in government with President Reagan also wanted to abolish the Department of Education. It is a very big, bloated bureaucracy running education at the local level from Washington. And there's a lot of pushback from that. But the support for the department lies with the teachers' unions in the United States, which are incredibly powerful.
I mean, abolishing the Department of Education sounds pretty drastic. I mean, it's a key department and it will shape future generations of Americans. What do you think Donald Trump's vision is for the education of the American people?
I believe that President-elect Trump believes what, frankly, President Reagan believed, that government should be much closer to the people and much closer to the point of service for the people. Education is a local matter, a state matter, and rather than having a giant bureaucracy in Washington telling localities and states what to do, that budget would be administered by state and local governments rather than by a bloated bureaucracy in Washington. So students would still get a lot of attention. There would be still a tremendous amount of taxpayer support for education. It would be a change in how that support is administered.
Okay, some of the other picks that I wanted to discuss with you for the new Trump administration. Matt Gaetz, Pete Hegseth, yes. Two men who've got sexual assault, sexual misconduct allegations hanging over them, which I should add they both deny. Do you think it's fair to say those two are perhaps the most controversial of all of the picks so far?
I think head and shoulders above the others is Matt Gaetz, as in terms of controversy. He's been a member of Congress. He's been investigated. He was investigated by the Justice Department, which did not bring charges on the sexual assault allegations. There is an investigation of the House Ethics Committee pending against him, which by resigning from the House, as he did last week, he has basically ended that. He's a very controversial figure. The term used most frequently to describe him is firebrand. He is incredibly outspoken and incredibly opinionated, and he does have views about the criminal justice system in the United States, which of course is the province of the Department of Justice. With respect to Pete Hegseth, he again is a highly educated, Princeton-educated young man in his 40s, popular because of his appearances on Fox News in America. He is a military veteran, a highly decorated veteran. And I think the president, if I could ascribe thought to President Trump in this case, I would say President-elect Trump sees in him a man who understands the enlisted person in the American military, as opposed to the military brass in Washington. And again, it's the notion of putting people who understand below the top management level what's going on in the Defense Department seems to be the goal there for the president. They are both controversial. They will have to go through this arduous process, which I don't envy them. But it is the process that it is, and they are the president-elect's choices, and therefore, who knows? But it's important for your viewers to keep in mind, President Trump, although he will always be President Trump because he was president before and you carry the title for life, he's currently president-elect, doesn't take office till the 20th of January. These people are not nominated yet. They are his list of desired people to appoint come January. And he has the ability between now and the 60 days that follow to withdraw any of them and reappoint other people, announce other potential appointees as well. So it's not done until the formal announcements once he is formally president.
Sure, and you said at the beginning of this answer that Matt Gaetz was head and shoulders above Pete Hegseth on the sort of the controversy stakes. Yes. And I'm just wondering whether you think that translates into the likelihood that him passing Senate approval is probably going to be the most challenging of all of the hearings up until this point. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
At this moment, it certainly looks that way. He has managed to offend a number of Republicans, including Republican senators, who will now, in essence, stand in judgment of his appointment. And so he will have an uphill fight in getting confirmed. He does seem to be the most vulnerable of the intended nominees at this moment, but we still have some big ones out there. Treasury hasn't been announced yet, and others. So we'll have to see. But at this moment, he looks to be the most controversial and the individual who will have the most difficult time.
Quite a lot of dismantling likely to happen, or is being talked about, with these so-called disruptors who are on the list of nominees. I don't know if you think those labels are accurate or not, but Vice President-elect J.D. Vance talking about an FBI director that he wants who will, quote, dismantle the deep state. Now, the current FBI chief, Chris Wray, is meant to stay there until the year 2027, I gather. But do you think perhaps his head is on the block and he might end up being replaced? And what does dismantling the deep state mean as far as you're concerned?
Well, if you look back through recent history, going back to when Donald Trump ran for president in the first place in 2020, and then again, in 2016, and then again in 2020, and of course this time, there were a number of senior, I think the number was 51 exactly, current and former CIA, FBI, Department of Justice, and other intelligence officials who came out very strongly in opposition to his presidency, to being elected in the first place during his presidency. They were highly critical and highly vocal in that criticism. And that is the deep state. These are the people, what Ronald Reagan used to refer to as the nameless, faceless bureaucrats beneath the political appointees, some of which are political appointees, like the FBI director and the CIA director. But what I would expect that very early in the administration, the president will order that those security clearances be lifted. That means they won't have access to top secret information from inside the government anymore. And you will see a whittling down of the power of these unelected officials in government to control or influence the agenda. It's going to be a very difficult thing. I think what you will see is a concerted effort, not just on the part of the CIA director and the FBI director and the vice president of the United States, but also the DOGE group, the Department of Government Efficiency group, led by Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk. I think you will see them working together with the vice president and others in the administration to try and rein in the unfettered power of the federal government of the United States.
Yeah, rein in unfettered power, and they have another massive challenge, which is to unite a deeply divided country. And I'm just wondering, lastly, whether you think Donald Trump plans to try and unite the United States? And if so, how he plans to do this?
It will be interesting to watch how Donald Trump goes about this, because he has been and remains a divisive figure. But the difference between now and come January and January of 2016 is he does have a mandate. He won more of the popular vote than his opponent did. He won the Electoral College with 321 votes. He took the Senate and retained the House of Representatives. That is a mandate. It is not a landslide, but it is a mandate. He has been elected by the people to do this. The other thing that's interesting, if you listen to political pollsters, which are largely discredited right now, but one of the things that came through loud and clear in this campaign that worked to Donald Trump's favor is the question of disruption. And a majority of Americans, a clear majority of Americans, either wanted major disruption or chaos. They were in favor of that. And Donald Trump is the candidate to deliver that.
Okay, well, we'll have to wait and see how events unfold. Thank you very much indeed. Mary Jo Jacobi, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
Well, that is all we have time for this special edition of Global News Today, wherever you are in the world. And if you're celebrating Christmas, we wish you all the very best.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,